were shaking anyway, so I didn't mind, but I struggled to remain conscious. I felt very faint, and I knew that was the loss of blood. Searching, I found what I was looking for. Alexander striding into the room, his eyes ablaze in anger. An aura of light around him as if he was lit up from within. I knew without a doubt that it was a physical manifestation of the power he held. Power so vast that it pressed on me, pushing me down now that he wasn't containing it. Beside me, Luke and the Millers were equally floored. The woman face down on the carpet while Luke struggled to stay on all four. Only Mr. Miller seemed able to withstand it somewhat. Alexander stepped over my father's body without glancing at it and plucked Luke off the floor as if he weighed absolutely nothing, raising a hand as if he meant to punch him. "Alexander!" My voice sounded shaky as I called for his attention. His eyes snapped to me, and then he tossed Luke with a bare flick of his wrist. The vampire slammed into a wall and crumpled to the floor. The next instant, the pressure of power was gone, and he stopped glowing like he was lit from within. He knelt in front of me and picked me up, pressing me into his chest tightly. "Agromokrowi?" The words might be sweet, but his voice shook with rage barely controlled. He pressed my head to the side, much like Luke had done, but he was gentle about it. Then, without warning, he pressed his own mouth to my neck. I was still bleeding there, although I hadn't noticed, but it didn't hurt when he touched his mouth to the small puncture wounds. Shocked, I realized he'd just licked over the spot, but immediately the last remnants of burning and pain disappeared. That done, he pulled away to hold me at arm's length, his eyes skimming over me to check for other injuries. Over his shoulder, I could see Mr. Miller get to his feet and pull out something from under his shirt. A gun. "Alexander!" I tried to warn him, instantly linking my mind with his and shoving the image I'd just seen at him. "I don't know who you are, boy, but you made a mistake," Mr. Miller said with a cold voice, his fangs peeking out when he talked. Alexander met my eyes, and I was shocked to see a cold smirk on his features. Then he turned around, one arm still holding me and keeping me behind him so I was not in line of the gun. "I think you are the one making a mistake here, Mr. Miller." His voice was cold too. "Get out before I empty this gun on you. This is a vampire-owned restaurant. No one will call the cops, and no one will hear." Mr. Miller shook as he spoke, but his eyes narrowed and the pupils did something freaky, widening and then narrowing in an even pattern. Alexander barked a laugh. "That does not work on me, Mr. Miller. You are a fool for trying." Then he stepped closer to the older man, although come to think of it, I wasn't so sure who was the oldest of the two of them. Alexander stepped so close that the barrel of the gun was pressed right against his chest. "I will shoot," the vampire warned, and when Alexander just threw back his head and laughed, as if he really found that highly amusing, the man actually did pull the trigger. I knew I screamed, loudly, but Alexander's body didn't even shake at the impact. 6 bangs resounded, and then it was quiet except for Alexander, who was still laughing. Peeking from under his arm, I saw that Mr. Miller was staring from Alexander to the gun as if he couldn't comprehend what had happened. I saw 6 bullets lying on the floor, each flattened as if they'd hit a very hard surface at a high velocity. "Bullets don't hurt me, Mr. Miller. Now, you have offended me greatly. You were hurting my mate and your son just fed off her without permission. You know the penalty for that." In the silence that followed, Mr. Miller dropped to his knees and started pleading incoherently. His wife a few feet away did the same, interspersed with keening wails. It wasn't hard to guess. Alexander was telling them that Luke had to die. Punishment for feeding from me when I hadn't permitted him to. Because I was Alexander's. You can't decide that. Luke struggled to his feet from a pile of broken chairs and glared at Alexander. "My father is a very high-ranking vampire, and you are nothing. You can't tell anyone how to punish me. I did nothing wrong." I flinched when Alexander whipped around to face the boy, power pulsating underneath my hands where I was holding the back of his shirt. If I hadn't been holding him, the sheer power would have forced me to my knees, much like it did with the other vampires. "I'm pretty sure, boy," Alexander said coldly, "that I outrank your father. Since you are about to die, I will tell you who I am, since you seem to be too stupid to realize it yourself. My name is Alexander Clitton." Luke's mouth worked soundlessly, and then he sagged down completely, his eyes rolling into the back of his head. Alexander turned to face his parents again. "You have till tomorrow. After that, I never want to see either of you again. Brittany, let's go." He pulled me with him towards the door, his strides large and fast, so I had to run to keep up. Alexander? My family? I asked softly just before we walked out. He turned his stormy gray eyes on me and blinked. They don't deserve your concern, agramokroi, he said, but he snapped his fingers anyway. One look behind me told me both Jennifer and Stephanie were waking up again. Even my father was stirring. Come, Alexander said, and he picked me up in his arms. To my surprise, there was a car outside waiting for us, and he carefully sat me down in the passenger seat. He smoothed his hands gently over my hair, and then leaned his forehead against mine. Next time, Brittany, next time you call me the moment you realize they are vampires. It was not a question, but a demand. I felt too faint to protest though, so I nodded. Can we leave now? I really want to shower and curl up in bed. I want to forget. My voice sounded tiny as I spoke, and it was very hard to hide the hurt inside. My father had just tried to sell me to a bunch of crazy vampires, all for some lousy deal which I was sure was off now. No matter that the man had been a stranger to me even though I'd lived with him for 3 years. I was still his flesh and blood, and it hurt that he would do that. Because he was my father and I wanted him to love me. Alexander was right though. They didn't deserve it. Not one bit. Not my concern, and not my love. And not my attention. They certainly didn't deserve to have Andy. What would happen to my little brother now that I'd left? There was no way my father was going to allow me back in the house, and I was pretty sure I didn't want that either. To be under the same roof with people that had betrayed me. Alexander climbed into the driver's seat and started driving, his eyes more on me than on the road. But I wasn't scared we would crash. Not him. What I'd seen tonight, the sheer power, that presence, I didn't know what he was anymore, but I was sure he wasn't just an ordinary vampire. No way in hell was that possible. His name alone had struck so much fear inside Luke that he'd passed out. I was pretty sure that vampires didn't just pass out. Not easily, at least. We were almost home when I realized Luke was going to be executed. By who or what I didn't know, but there was no doubt in my mind that it was going to happen if I didn't put a stop to it. I didn't want to be responsible for someone's death. Alexander? I asked, and I hated how I sounded so weak. It wasn't going to help Luke's fate if I was. Alexander wouldn't believe me if I tried to convince him it wasn't as bad as it looked, and he didn't deserve to die if I sounded like that. Agramokroi, he asked softly, but there was still the sense of a steel blade covered with silk. He was very angry, not at me, but at the Miller family and my father. Is Luke really going to die? It was quiet a moment, and then his features softened. I forget, Britt. You are human and very innocent. Yes, he is going to die. It is our law, and if we do not uphold it, vampires all over the territory will see it as a weakness and run rampant, indulging themselves in their sickest desires. He broke the law, a sacred law. For that, he dies. I swallowed. I don't want him to die. He's just a kid. It scared me a little how utterly ruthless Alexander sounded. It didn't seem to bother him in the least that a living being, or well, undead being, was going to be sniffed out. Destroyed. Yes, he is a kid, but he is also 120 years old. A gramokroi. He had a longer life than most will ever have, and still he learned no respect. Do not pity a creature like him. He was weak. The gravel crunched as we stopped in the drive in front of the house. Alexander was out off the car and at my door in the blink of an eye, opening it and picking me up gently to carry me inside. I protested, I can walk. I no longer feel faint, which was true, although I felt battered and dirty. My voice had gained in strength too. Humor me, agramokroi. He no longer seemed angry, but he was still intent, and his bones were sharply defined against the flawless skin on his face. Those stormy gray eyes dark, but even though I knew that indicated either hunger, anger, or lust, all of which would trigger the fangs, I saw no glimpse of them as he talked. I wondered at the control that meant he had. None of the Millers had been able to stop themselves when blood had been spilled. The house was dark when we entered, and I guessed everyone else was out. Alexander strode up the stairs and straight to his own room at the end without pause. Despite what had happened tonight, that still gave me a nervous shiver. The way he just assumed I'd be sleeping in his room with him. He sat me down on the edge of the bed and then stood back, folding his arms across his chest. He was looking down at me with this stern look on his face that told me he wasn't pleased at all. At his look, I took off my coat, and at his gasp, I frowned and looked down at myself. No! The dress was still whole and only the bruise on my thigh showed. Nothing to warrant a gasp. "You went out dressed like that?" Alexander said, and he sounded seriously pissed off again, his stormy eyes sparkling dangerously. I met his stare, obviously. "You can't decide what I wear, so stop that." I stood up and kicked off the heels, then made my way over to his closet, deciding that I might as well take some of his clothes to wear to bed after I showered. "Brittany?" His voice was still tight and controlled, but he stepped up behind me as I rummaged through his clothes, trying to find something suitable to wear to bed. He reached over me and pulled a pair of boxers and a shirt from a shelf and handed them to me. His chest pressed against my back. It made my breath hitch in my throat as I felt how warm he was. Solid and powerful. "Thanks," I said, and tried to slip past him to go to the ensuite bathroom. His arms held me in place. "Brittany, we weren't done talking." I glared at him. "Alexander?" But then I caught the look on his face, anger, concern, and from his eyes reflected this bone-wrenching need to ensure that I was safe. "If you must know, Stephanie and Jennifer picked out the dress. I would never, by choice, wear something like this." I relented, reaching out to press the palm of my hand against his cheek, my thumb rubbing over the sharp line of his jaw. I could see his shoulders visibly relax, and then he shook his head. "So you let your stepsister and mother dress you, but not me?" "That's different." "Different? How a gramo quai?" he asked. But I was relieved to note that he wasn't angry any longer. His head tilted a little to the side in amusement and curiosity. "Well, for one, if I hadn't put it on, they'd have gotten my dad to punish me. Or they might have done something to Andy." Just like that, the moment was shattered. My shoulders slumped as I remembered how I'd left my little brother behind. Right in the hands of the people I hated most. With a father that didn't love him and didn't care for him. Alexander pulled me into his arms to hold me close. "Shh, it's okay, Britt. Don't worry, we'll go get him tomorrow." He sounded fierce. The words not just a promise to ease my mind, but a thing he was certain of. "How?" "My dad is his legal guardian. I can't just take him away. They could charge me of kidnapping or something." I knew only too well that my father wouldn't let Andy go with me without a fight. He might tell us all the time how we should be grateful he'd taken us in, but he still wouldn't let us go until he'd made sure he'd gained something from it. I had a lawyer look into it. Gramokoye, Alexander sounded certain. "All we need is for your father to sign the adoption papers." I felt warm inside that he'd taken the trouble to do that even though he'd never met Andy. Still, I shook my head. "My father will never sign those papers." "Alexander, not unless he'll profit from it." I was picked right off the floor and carried towards the bathroom, a smirk on his lips now. "You underestimate me a run. Now shower, unless you want me to bite you too." With his words, I realized that my shoulder was stained red where blood had dripped from the puncture wounds. Part of the dress stained a much darker red. "Thank you," I said, hurrying inside and closing the door behind me. I could hear him laugh as I locked the door. Obviously, he thought it funny that I was rushing now. Did he think I was afraid he'd just bite me? He'd already told me he didn't feel the desire to drink my blood, that he found it repulsing to desecrate me in such a way. As I stood under the hot water, it first ran red and then a rust brown before becoming clear again. I hadn't realized how much blood I lost, but as I felt at my neck, I could find no puncture wounds whatsoever. A check in the mirror not much later told me there was nothing to see either, but my side was mottled purple and blue. I counted myself very lucky to have escaped today with so little injuries. The shirt Alexander had given me was a long-sleeved button-up one, immaculately white. The fabric incredibly soft against my skin as I shrugged into it. The thread count surely in the millions. The ends dangled down to mid-thigh, pretty much hiding the dark boxers. I stepped out of the bathroom slowly, a little unsure about revealing the length of my legs. Although of course that dress hadn't done much to cover them either. Alexander was sprawled on the bed, his body covered from the waist down by the duvet. His chest and face thrown in stark contrast by the lamp on the bedside table. It painted his flawless skin golden even though it was normally more pale. His eyes shone in the light, reflecting it and throwing it back into the room. A smirk on his lips as he watched me approach the bed slowly. He didn't hide how he followed the neckline of the shirt to glance at the little cleavage showing. I had left the top few buttons undone. He lifted his hand and beckoned me to come closer, his other one picking up the book from his lap he'd been reading and depositing it beside the bed. He didn't say a word, but the darkening of his eyes said enough. Shivers shot down my spine as anticipation uncurled in my stomach, heat spreading through my body under his gaze. When I reached the bed, he lifted the duvet and tugged me under it and straight into his arms. His arms then curling protectively around me as if he planned to shield me from the entire world. We both breathed in and out deeply once, and then I heard him say in amusement, "Yes, we missed each other." He fisted one hand in my hair at the nape of my neck, while his other arm pulled me into his lap, shifting my leg so I was straddling him. That hand on the nape of my neck felt possessive and powerful, and I knew that before he'd been holding back, afraid to show me all of himself. But tonight, I'd seen the powerful side of him, a leader, although that word was much too tame and incomplete. My skin sizzled where it touched his, and I stared up into the stormy gray of his eyes. They now held a tenderness that made my heart clench, that reached to the very core of me to show me how much he truly cared. He ran a single finger across the bare skin of my abdomen, tracing a line of fire that shot sensations right down to the center of my body. My breathing hitched in my throat, but I narrowed my eyes. It was unfair that he could affect me such. "We're not done talking yet," I said, but my voice sounded husky, desire lacing through it and lessening my glare. He smiled, just the barest tug of his lips curving upward, but amusement reflected in those stormy pools. "Then Taka, Kuramochwa. Why was that vampire so scared of you that he passed out when he heard your name? Who are you really?" The question burned in my mind. I could imagine only a few reasons why Luke had been so terrified. Alexander had to be really powerful and probably very important. But I'd never hear him mention any other vampires, and he seemed to avoid them as much as possible. Alexander nodded slowly at my question as if he had expected it, and then he started to glow, power pulsing underneath his skin, lighting him up from within, his face turning ascetic, the bones tight underneath the faintly golden yet pale skin. Still, he was hauntingly beautiful and masculine in an otherworldly form. Unlike in the restaurant, the power this time didn't bring me to my knees from the sheer intensity. I was of course already seated, straddling his long legs, but it had my skin sizzling and my hair flying backwards in an unseen wind. My heartbeat thumping erratically against my rib cage. More than that, the power seemed to flow right out of his hands through my body, a sensual caress. The arousal coursing through me shocked me, but I couldn't hold back the moan that fell from my lips as that power caressed me in the most intimate of ways. As I explained to you before, the power a vampire holds grows over time if the blueprint is there. Age does not automatically mean power, but heritage can. His voice was still the same as I was used to, but more serious, and there was an echo, a resonance of that power that lit him up like a bonfire. I wanted to speak, ask him another question, but although the power seemed to be receding again, sucked into his skin till the eerie light had all but disappeared. A last tendril of that power stroked across my body, making my nipples tight with need. He wasn't playing fair. My mother, she was Kaleach. Witch. It was a strictly matriarchal society at the time, still is. But when we were born, one did not teach men about witchcraft. We might know of its existence, but never could we participate. Having recovered from the blast of his sensual caress, I narrowed my eyes at him to tell him I did not like the way he'd teased me. His stormy eyes had lost their solemn look as he talked, clearly enjoying the effect of his power on me. "Your witch blood has proven to have given you the blueprint for this power. The light?" "Ora?" I asked him. Instead of replying, he gripped my hip with one hand and shifted me, moving my body closer so that our chests pressed together. His other hand let go off my hair to stretch out across the headboard of the bed he was leaning against. "I do not scare you?" Confused, I shook my head. "Why would you?" "I know you'd never harm me, Alexander." He smiled, a slow, lazy smile this time, but I could see the happiness dancing in his eyes. A touch on my mind to show me he was pleased with my answer. Yes, the witch blood gave Sarah her great telepathic abilities and would probably have augmented Bob as well had he not been weakened when he created us. Me, I've been strong from the very first day of my creation, physically stronger than most newborn vampires. Mental shields in place that granted me immunity to many of the older vampires' abilities. It's why from the very first day of my existence as a vampire, I had to fight to survive. Jealousy and fear of what I'd become as I grew older sparked a mad hunt to end my unnatural life before it could even start properly. He fell quiet, and I saw his eyes turn inward as he remembered those very first days of his existence. It seemed some of his mental shields were down, or maybe I was just more sensitive to him, but I could feel the fear and the pain, the confusion he'd felt when he had to fight so hard for his survival and that of his siblings. The memories were none pleasant, all dark shadows. A sudden smirk appeared on his face as he said, "Now no one but the strongest would dare lay a finger against me or mine. And you, Brittany, you are mine." I shivered at those words, feeling both a little angry that he would claim such complete possession over me and a hot feminine appreciation for that power. So very masculine and strong. And as I thought about it, I realized I could lay claim on him too. "If I am yours, then you are mine," I told him, glad that, although I sounded husky, my voice did not quiver, and the words rang clear. Alexander's eyes met mine in a piercing stare, but he nodded, his voice low and rough as he said, "Acknowledged a gror more croy." Before I could say or ask anything else, he pressed his lips against mine. Nothing gentle or soft about his touch now, just pure, unadulterated lust. I let him kiss me with slow toe-curling preciseness. Let his hands caress my hair back from my face, and run across my back all the way down to the bottom of the shirt. I even let him run his hands back up the skin of my back, inside the shirt, my mind slowly turning to mush as pleasure from every touch made my body sing, a humming in my veins that could only lead to more pleasure. It was exactly what I needed to forget all about the pain and rejection I felt over the way my father had tried to sell me. I felt a release of tension as well, and I knew it had everything to do with the fact that we'd been apart for such a long time, against our will. My own hands found their way into his lush, silky hair, running my fingers through the strands. His mouth left mine to follow the curve of my jaw to the sensitive spot below my ear. There he bit down softly, without fangs. Kissing over the sensual hurt, he whispered, "I would mark you here a gramo kroi, where everyone can see. Always." A blush rose on my cheeks, and I pushed against his shoulders to create a little distance, my breath coming in gasps. "And where would you want me to mark you?" I understood why he wanted the mark to be visible. It served as protection against every other supernatural creature out there. "You can mark me anywhere, Britt." A dark, sensual promise held within those words, as if he dared me to explore his body before I decided. Feeling shy under his gaze, I ran my fingers across his chest, feeling the taut muscle. He caught my mouth in another hot kiss, teeth grazing over my lips begging entrance. When I refused, they turned more demanding, and suddenly I was on my back, Alexander hovering over me. A moan escaped my lips as his lower half collided with mine, the act very deliberate. His arousal so obvious. At the moan, he never hesitated to take the opportunity to possess my mouth. His kiss, one of a man who knew the effect he had, taking full advantage. My legs wrapped around him to pull him even closer. The friction against my center caused my spine to arch, pressing my breasts up against his bare chest. My fingers were digging into the sleek muscle of his shoulders as he held himself above me without effort. I wanted more. I wanted to feel all of him against me and fall right off the edge that I seemed balanced on. Skillful fingers teased across my skin, and the shirt fell open at the front, revealing my bare chest to his hungry eyes. He broke away from kissing me and openly looked down at me. Then slowly, leisurely, he lifted one large, heavy hand to rub a circle around a nipple. He took his time, trailing his lips down across the newly exposed skin. Wet, open-mouthed kisses. Surprisingly, it didn't hurt when he touched the bruised skin of my side. I felt only pleasure. I wanted to blush and tell him how I'd never done this before, that he was the first to ever touch me in such a way, but the words passed my lips as a moan, husky and unrecognizable. "Again?" demanded Alexander as the sound died, and he licked across skin so sensitive that it had me arching off the bed, screaming as I came undone. My vision swam and my breath came in short gasps, my fingers scratching across the skin of his back as I scrambled to hold on. Alexander stilled his movements entirely to stare intently at my face, a soft smile on his sensual lips. His eyes filled with male pride, and something tender and filled with love and acceptance. Then he rolled off me, taking my body with him to press me in the crook underneath his arm, my face against his neck. The loss of warmth and friction against the V between my legs made me shiver, but I felt boneless and suddenly very drowsy. One large hand pulled my leg up to entwine with his, and then the duvet slipped over us to shut out the cold of the night. "Sleep agahamo kwai," he whispered softly, caressing my cheek as he turned off the light, plunging us into darkness. His chest was hot against the bare skin of my breasts, but despite the incredibly pleasant sensation, I felt my mind drifting off. "Alexander, what about you?" My voice hushed with sleep. A fight to keep my drooping lids open. A dark laugh that shook his body. "We have eternity, Brittany. Do not worry." Eternity with this man, Alexander Clitton. That didn't sound too bad. My barefooted footsteps echoed on the tiled floor in the hall, careless about all the white sand I was tracking in. The house always echoed if Mom wasn't there. It was her presence that filled this place and made it home. I tossed my bag to the floor, knowing Mom would probably scold me for that later, but not caring about it. With her easy smile and always laughing eyes, I knew she could never be mad at me for long. Faith in that knowledge only a 9-year-old could possess. Thinking Mom wasn't home yet because of the echo, I ran into the kitchen. If I was lucky, the cookie jar would be on the lower shelf and I'd be able to reach it if I climbed on the counter. I skidded to a halt just inside the kitchen and stared at the scene before me. My 9-year-old mind couldn't quite understand what it was seeing. Clown, seated at the kitchen table, as always, dressed in a flowery summer dress that made her look like a fairy stepped right out of a fairy tale. So graceful and elegant, movements lithe and sure, like those of a dancer. I loved watching my mom move, loved it even more when she danced. My mom would smile then, and it made her look so beautiful. My mom was light, and she shone like no other adult ever did, because my mom had stories. So many stories. But today there was no easy smile, no laughter in her vibrant brown eyes that looked so much like mine. Her light had dulled, and her face was pale and drawn. "Mom?" I asked hesitantly, my voice trembling as fear curled in my tiny stomach. Had someone hurt her? The fierce need to protect my flighty mother with her delicate features shook my small body. She hadn't noticed me yet, but at the hesitant call, her head whipped in my direction. Panic and fear pulsating in the air. "No, Brittany, run. Not my daughter. Please?" Sheer terror reflected in my mom's melodic voice, a voice made to sing. Confused, I turned around. I wasn't going to leave my mom alone. If she was scared, I needed to help her. A hand closed around my throat, tight and constricting, and above that red eyes gleamed in a face made of shadows. "Hello, little angel." I woke screaming and drenched in cold sweat, my mind filled with swirling darkness and painful memories. My heartbeat pounding in my ears, a wild beating against my ribcage. I was shaking, and hot tears were streaming down my face, tears I hardly even noticed. My mind still locked in the harsh grip of my memories. Memories that I'd buried so deep that I didn't even know I had them. As my breathing slowed down and my rapid pulse calmed, I became aware of the strong arms wrapped around me, the muscled chest pressed against my back, and the silky fingers running through my hair. A distinctly male voice whispering in a language I couldn't understand, but they were gentle, soft words meant to calm. Alexander, my soulmate, held me as if he'd take on the world to keep me safe. He held me with such gentleness and love that it nearly broke me after the harsh reality of my memories. "Gramo kroi. Shh, it's all right. You are safe," and his voice reflected his concern. But even though he didn't know the reason for my distress, he didn't ask. Anger coiled beneath the surface at the thought that something had hurt me, and he couldn't do anything about it. When my tears subsided, I slowly uncurled from his tight grasp so I could face him, but I didn't let go. I needed the physical reassurance. I needed to know that he was here, to anchor me to this place. I remembered Alexander, a sob I tried to suppress. I remembered things I shouldn't. They should have stayed buried, because I had remembered the glorious days when my mother had been happy, when we had been happy together, just the two off us. But most of all, I'd remembered the day things had changed, the day the darkness had come, a day I had wanted to stay forgotten. My mom had broken that day, and I had been so young and helpless. I had not understood what was going on. Why? I understood now that the darkness had come, and that 9 months later, my baby brother had been born. Exactly 9 months later, I burst into tears all over again. That was knowledge I wanted so badly to forget, because I didn't want to see Andy as the child born from darkness, and light because my mom had been light. But mostly darkness. Alexander said nothing. He simply held me close as he stroked my skin, my scalp in soothing patterns. He didn't ask what it was that I wanted to forget, and for that I was grateful. Light filtered into the room by the time I felt calm enough to fall back asleep, and still he held me. As I drifted off, I heard him sing the by now familiar lullaby in his native tongue, his voice husky and very male but still beautiful. Ah! I awoke from a pleasant, dreamless sleep a few hours later to find myself alone in the big bed. A dress clearly belonging to Sarah was draped over a chair nearby, meant for me to wear today. Because all my things were at the empty house, where Andy still was. My heart kicked uncomfortably against my ribs at the thought of my little brother. Guilt, because I'd left him alone in the clutches of my father for a night, abandoned him, even though I'd promised not to, but also fear that coated my tongue and made my skin crawl. Fear that the darkness that had killed my mom, created my baby brother, hid inside him, ready to strike out. A nauseating fear was spreading through me, and it wasn't fair. I loved my brother to death. He couldn't be part darkness. Couldn't be. But now that I'd remembered, I wasn't sure if I could see him in the same light, treat him the same way as I had before. I splashed my face with cold water, and then got dressed in the clothes Sarah had laid out for me. I was grateful that my friend had thought to do so. I wouldn't have been able to put on the dress from last night again, and I wasn't going to wear something of Alexander's if we were going back to the big house. Downstairs I found nobody, and that worried me, but someone had laid out food for me in the large warm kitchen. It was still strange to me that they had such a beautiful kitchen when they didn't have to eat food. After I had eaten the food, I carefully sent a thought towards Alexander. Alexander? Where are you? His reply was immediate and incredibly relieving. In the study, a gran ochoa. Moments later, I pushed open the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the study. It was a surprisingly brightly lighted room. Large open windows with French doors lined one wall. They were draped with heavy dark red curtains, but those were opened to the fullest. On one wall, there was a large old-fashioned fireplace with soft and incredibly comfortable-looking leather chairs in front of it. The walls lined with oak bookcases filled with old leather-bound volumes and crisper-looking new books side by side. Some spaces on the shelves devoid of books, but instead holding a beautiful object of art, a precious stone, or some other knick-knack Alexander had collected, a testimony of the memories of a long life. Right in front of the windows, a solid cherry wooden desk stood, stark lines that looked infinitesimally male. On top of it, a high-tech computer and phone and stacks of paper. Alexander was seated behind it, his forehead creased in concentration as he pored over the papers. It took me a moment to realize that he was in fact grading papers for school. Obviously, he had to do that as a teacher. The fact that I didn't see him as a teacher any longer had made me overlook that. A blush rose to my cheek as I remembered what we'd shared last night before, the dreams of memory. When my eyes came back to him, I found him staring at me with a knowing smirk on his face. "Morning, a gran mocroi. You look delectable in that dress," he said. Then he crooked a finger. "Come." I wanted to resist, simply because I didn't want to be commanded like that. I wasn't some silly girl. I was his soulmate and his equal. But the memories still haunted me, and I needed to be close to him, because he could give me solace, the kind I'd hungered for ever since my mother died. So I walked over and around the massive desk to stand beside him, and I didn't protest when he drew me into his lap and held me close in the circle of his arms. Nothing was said as I rested my head on the wide expanse of his muscular chest, breathing in the scent of him and the warmth that would keep me anchored to this world. He played with the pendant on its silver chain around my neck as he continued to work, the movement thoughtless. It was cute how my very old and very powerful mate had fallen for such an uncontrolled motion. At long last, he leaned back in his chair, sliding the last paper on top of a stack. "All done," he sighed as he returned his attention on me, sliding a hand into my hair rub unknown tension away. His other hand still playing with the pendant, my mother's pendant, shaped like an angel's wing, content to just still and let him go through the soothing motions, even though I no longer needed them. Both my hands clasped loosely in his shirt, he hadn't bothered to fully button it, allowing me to see a perfect triangle of his chest. Skin that softly golden color. What's the story behind the necklace, Britt? Alexander asked softly. His eyes held curiosity only as he peered at the intricately wrought pendant. The lines so delicate and so perfect that the silver wing looked real, alive. I smiled. This was a happy memory, as I told him. It was my mother's and her mother's before her. She always told me that a man came from the heavens one day, a man of gold. Golden hair and golden skin, as if the sun lived inside him. The pendant was his gift to my grandmother, and he told her to pass it on to her firstborn child. My mom always said that if we were in need of help, we could wish on the pendant and the man from the heavens would come to save us. An angel. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. It's funny how you say your mother describes this man as if the sun lived inside of him. That was what I thought when I first laid eyes on you, Brittany. I smiled at the flattery. My mom never saw the man. Grandma met him just before Mom was born, and the sun does not live inside of me. If it did, I wouldn't miss it so badly. I love the sea and the beach and the days filled with sunshine. It's so much colder here. When it's time to move a gramo Troy, we'll move to somewhere warm and sunny. It's a promise, Alexander whispered, pressing his lips softly to my cheek. I could feel a driving need coming from him that said he wanted to do anything and everything to make me happy. His voice turned curious again as he shifted the pendant in his hold, inspecting it intently with his beautiful, stormy gray eyes. It's possible, I suppose. Looks too delicate and real to be human-made. A gasp escaped my lips. You're saying this really could be angel-made? Angels are real? A chuckle as he nodded. Yes, real, but not in the way they're usually thought of. Sometimes they fall in love with a human. It happens. I hit his chest. That's not very funny. If that's true, then I'm part angel. Don't be ridiculous. Jumping out of his lap, I smoothed the dress down. I felt uncomfortable in it. Not used to the off-the-shoulder model that suited Sarah so well. Alexander's looked lost in thought, almost as if he had not heard my last words. Then he shook himself and picked up a folder. These are the adoption papers. Agramo Shroy. You can sign them now if you'd like. All we'd need then is your father's signature. You really think this is going to work? I asked hesitantly. I pushed the tendril of fear away into a dark corner in my mind. Getting Andy out of there was more important then. Worrying over the darkness that might have fathered him. Trust me. The words were said with enough conviction that it left no doubt in my mind that he would manage to do this somehow. Of course, I hadn't really factored in all the vampiric powers he had, although putting my dad to sleep wouldn't really help in getting his signature. And he couldn't expose himself as a vampire either. Thinking about it, however, I knew that Jennifer and Stephanie knew about vampires, but I wasn't sure if they'd realized that Alexander was one. Come to think of it, I wasn't sure if Stephanie had even seen Alexander. After all, last night he'd made them sleep before he'd even entered the room. At the door, Alexander handed me his coat, a leather one that smelled distinctly like him. I accepted it because I didn't really want to wear my own coat. It had bloodstains on the collar. He smirked at me when I accepted it without complaint. I like it when you wear my things. Love it when my scent is all over you. With those words, he strode out the door and straight to his flashy red and very fast car. I had to unscramble my mind first before I followed him out. His scent all over me? His tone had implied a lot more than just the scent rubbing off on me from his clothes. The car ride was far too short, and by the time we reached the house, my fists were clenched tightly on my knees, my stomach a cold knot. I hoped no one was home except my father and I could just take my things and Andy's things and leave. I didn't want to face my father either, but we needed his signature to get Hay out of there. Still, I could hope I didn't have to deal with Stephanie and Jennifer on top of it all. Alexander reached over and took my hand tightly in his. This is what we're gonna do. We enter, pack your stuff up, and get it to the car. They can't protest about that. After that, we corner your father and get his signature. Then we pack up Andy's stuff and leave. I assume it won't take long? Sarah said your room was very empty. I breathed in deeply and nodded. I don't want Hay to think I'm going to leave him behind if he sees me take my stuff first. I didn't finish what I was going to say, but Alexander nodded. We'll talk to your father first then, but you're not leaving my side? Got it? I'm not letting you alone in there with anyone but your brother. I don't trust them. His voice took on a sharp edge, and his stormy eyes became dark. So very dark. I touched his face, rubbing my fingers over his jaw. I know, I won't leave your side. You're the badass vamp, they can't hurt me when you're there. You'll protect me? A smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Damn right I am. I'll always protect you, Britt. Always. Shortly after that, I found myself unlocking the front door and stepping into the big house. My footsteps echoed, but I couldn't hear Alexander move as he stepped inside, right on my heels. He was like a shadow, so silent. Where is your father, you think? He asked me in a low voice. The Irish accent replaced by the crisp British again, now that someone else might possibly hear us. I nodded down the hall, in his study if he's home. He's always working. Alexander didn't miss the rueful tone in my voice. As he stalked past me, a predator let loose. He ran his knuckles softly across my cheek to reassure me. I followed him down the hall and pointed him to the right door. He stood still for a moment in front of it and then nodded. He's here. He must have caught my father's scent, or maybe even heard his heartbeat behind that door. That was the only way he could have known. Alexander didn't knock as he pushed open the door and strode inside. His movements pure lethal grace. He was a hunter stalking prey. Although I imagined that vampires didn't stalk prey this way usually, going for seduction instead. My father looked up from the dark desk he was sitting behind, a phone pressed to his ear that he dropped in shock at seeing Alexander. Shortly after that, his mask of cool reserve had been restored and he looked all business. He cast me one look from the corner of his eye as I stepped into the office behind Alexander. Who are you? The hostile tone in my father's voice wasn't hard to miss. But Alexander's voice was all cool and collected, cold enough to give even me chills as he said, "Let's talk business, you and I." It was something my father understood as he rose from his leather chair, reaching out a hand across his desk to shake Alexander's. The name is Henry Tallior, but I think you already knew that. Alexander Clitton, said my mate, but he ignored my father's hand and leaned his fists on the edge of the desk, leaning in so my father sat back down, a crack appearing in that mask of cool reserve on the man I had to call father for 3 years now. What business did you wish to discuss? My father asked. Had it been someone else, he'd have insisted on having at least an appointment scheduled, and there would have been a scolding for barging in like this. Clearly he found Alexander too intimidating to do so. Alexander pulled the folder with the adoption papers out of his pocket and dropped it on the desk. I want you to sign this, and I won't take no for an answer. We'll see about that boy, my father said coldly. Seemed like he'd found his spine back. I swallowed nervously. I hoped this aggressive way of dealing with my father worked. But Alexander was very rich and owned a dozen different companies, restaurants, and shops. On top of all the real estate he owned, he had to be one hell of a businessman. At the boys my father had used at the end of his sentence, Alexander simply stared at him coldly, waiting for him to open the file and read what it was about. It took only a short moment, and then I had the satisfaction of seeing my father gasp, his eyes widening in shock. These are adoption papers. You want me to give you my son? He sounded completely blown away by it. Not me, Brittany, Alexander said, his words clipped and short. I could feel the cold rage he held within himself. My father had no clue how close Alexander was to snapping his neck. But I did, and I didn't want Alexander to go down that path. I stepped closer to him and softly placed my hand on his back. Just a touch. But I felt the muscles beneath my hand relax just the slightest bit. Thank you. Showing me how grateful he was that I had acted to calm him down. I knew Alexander was furious about how my father treated me and my brother. My father stared down at the papers and then looked up at me and met my eyes. You want to raise your brother yourself? How are you going to do that? You left home, you have no money. I doubt you're in a position to take care of him. Alexander hissed, and my father's eyes flicked to him for a short moment before he decided to ignore it as impossible. It seemed he remembered nothing of the episode with the Millers last night. I can give him the love he needs, I said, but I knew that wouldn't convince my father. He didn't know what love was. If he did, he would have stuck around when my mother got pregnant of me. She might not have all those things, but I do, and Brittany is under my care. Alexander pulled my father's eyes away from me with a snap. So this is where you ran off to last night? You're sleeping with this man and you think that's a safe and steady environment you can expose your brother to? My father's mouth twisted in an ugly way. Before I could stop Alexander, he grabbed my father by the front of his crisp white shirt and dragged him up from his chair. "Don't you talk to Brittany like that. Now sign those papers. You know as well as I that you'd rather be rid of the boy. This way you never have to worry about them ever again." My father's eyes were so big that they seemed to be about to pop right out of his skull. But to his credit, he swallowed and said, "Do you really think so lowly of me?" Alexander's eyes shifted to me and then he said, "Brittany, why don't you get started on the packing? I'll finish this here." I'm sure Andy would love to hear the good news. My father had not yet caved, but Alexander seemed very confident. It also seemed like he didn't want me to witness what he was going to do next. My spine stiffened, and I was about to protest when he touched my mind with his. "Trust me." It was a repeat of the words he'd said to me earlier, and for once I decided to obey without protest. "Don't lose your soul, Alexander," I warned him as I stepped out of the room and closed the door behind me. Worried but still trusting Alexander to do what was right, I made my way up the stairs to my brother's room. He was probably there with a nanny, worried about why I hadn't returned home last night. I could only imagine what kind of lies Jennifer and Stephanie had made up about my absence. I found him seated on the floor in the middle of the room. His large golden eyes found mine and he stared at me. His lip immediately started to tremble as he fought back tears. "Brittany, you came back." I nearly broke down myself at the hopelessness in his voice. All my worries about darkness hiding inside him gone as I strode over and tugged him tightly into my embrace. The nanny behind him on the window seat met my eyes and smiled softly, as if she too was happy to see me. "You left," my little brother accused me, and I could only nod. "I did, Giant, but I came back for you and I'm taking you with me. It's our time now," I told him. He stiffened in my arms and then pulled back to look into my face. "Really?" "Yes, really, hey. We need to start packing. What toys do you want to take with you?" I told him, and I felt my own face pull into a smile. Over my brother's shoulder, I could see the nanny jump up and stride to the closet. She was ripping out a bag so quickly and started stuffing it with clothes that I had to wonder about what she'd seen and heard here. Realization dawned on Hayes' face, and then the biggest smile ever appeared on his face. Without words, he came back to hug me tightly. An hour later, Andy and I looked around at the pile of possessions in the hall by the front door. My baby brother looked utterly satisfied and kept reaching over to hold my hand, a smile on his face as he asked me if it was a dream or not. My heart glowed at the fact that I could assure him it was not a dream. Alexander had come up to my brother's room and helped us pack his things and then mine after a short 15 minutes. Looking out the window had shown me my dad getting into his car and speeding off. After that, no one had come to stop us. Stephanie had appeared, but she'd only looked at us with a quiet and guarded expression. It looked to me as if she'd been checking if the things we packed we only owe you our things and not any of the valuables, as if she thought we'd steal them. She'd been satisfied about that very quickly and had instead turned her attention on Alexander. Of course he'd draw her attention with his looks. He looked beautiful enough to fit right in among her many conquests. Her attention to him had pissed Alexander off enough that he'd snapped at her and then excused himself to make a few phone calls from his car. He hadn't come back inside the house yet, but I knew he was waiting right outside. I was, however, a little worried if we'd be able to get everything inside the car. I mean, his car was fast and pretty, but it didn't exactly have enough space. Not for all the bags and boxes. A look at the pile told me it wasn't that much, though. I had only 2 bags of clothing and a box filled with books, a small bag filled with some knickknacks and things I'd salvaged from my mother, while Andy had more or less the same amount of bags and boxes. When I opened the door, however, I saw Alexander's car driving away, speeding around the corner. For a moment, I stared at it in shock. Did he just leave me here? "Here, let me carry that." Alexander appeared by my side and took the bag and the box I'd been carrying from my arms. He looked at Andy and then winked. "You're a strong boy. You don't need any help at all." Waiting for us was Sarah with a bigger and much more practical station wagon. This car could easily hold all 4 of us and our luggage. "Hey, Brittany, Dennis and I thought this car would come in handy," Sarah greeted me. The car was loaded in no time, and Andy couldn't stop babbling about all kinds of things that he wanted to do and see to Sarah. It was quite obvious that Sarah adored my baby brother as much as I did. As we drove off, I noticed Jennifer standing on the steps at the front door, a look on her face that seemed intrigued, but she waved and sent us a tentative smile when she noticed Andy was waving at her. "You know, I feel sorry for her," said Sarah from the back seat. "Why?" I wondered. Jennifer had never been kind to me, and I had never seen her do anything nice for Andy either. If she hadn't had such a nasty mother, she would have been all right. I can tell. Her mind isn't rotten. Wrong. Not like Stephanie, Sarah explained. I cast a look at Andy, who stared at Sarah with big eyes. "You read minds?" he asked in open wonder. Smart as he was, he'd already figured out that that's what she'd been talking about. A lie rose to my lips. Andy didn't need to know these things, did he? "Yeah, I can read minds. Want to play a game?" "You think of something and I'll say what it is," Sarah said to the boy before I could open my mouth. A sound of protest died on my lips when Alexander placed his hand on my knee. "Don't worry, Guillermo Choi. Kids are good with things like this. Best tell them young, they're more accepting at that age." "Does he need to know?" I asked Alexander softly, knowing that he'd hear with his vampiric hearing, but that Andy wouldn't be able to hear a thing. Not that he was paying attention to me. He was frowning in concentration as he thought of things for Sarah to pick from his mind, laughing loudly every time she got it right. "We can't go around pretending to eat food every day, Britt. Gives us terrible indigestion," an amused sparkle in his eyes. "He's smart. He'd have figured it out by himself in no time." I nodded slowly, but still I was worried that it would scare him. Vampires and witches, they were always the bad guys in stories. Would it give him nightmares to know he was living with both? "Joppery. Thank you, hilarity. Whenever company's datey dame, it's in planning house. I dak is an 18 days arcacker. Whenever call is lessing." It was big and the walls were white and so were the curtains. But in the corner stood a big bed shaped like a castle. The bed was at the top and could be reached by a ladder, and underneath it was a room lit up with Christmas lights. Andy had stared at it with open-mouthed wonder and rushed to explore the contraption when Sarah told him that was his bed. After that, the three of us had spent a few hours unpacking the toys and putting away his clothes. Sarah was currently planning with him seated in the middle of the soft sky blue carpet, planning on what to paint on the walls and picking out the color of the curtains. She told me I could go if I wanted, so that I could unpack my own things, which is why I was currently wandering down the hall, wondering where my bags and boxes had gone, wondering if I was getting my own room or if Alexander wanted to share his. I knew I didn't really want my own room. I much preferred sleeping in his bed curled up in his arms, even though that made me blush a scarlet red as I remembered how Alexander had touched me last night, my very first orgasm. I didn't want to impose though, and decided to search for Alexander when I couldn't find my own things and ask him what he had in mind about the sleeping arrangements. He wasn't in his study or anywhere else downstairs, and I contemplated reaching for him with my mind to ask where he was. I scolded myself. Nothing wrong with a little walking around. This whole telepathy thing was making me lazy. As I passed Andy's new room on my way to Alexander's at the end of the hall, I heard laughter. Sarah was laughing so hard she sounded like she was nearly choking, while Andy was yelling enthusiastically about how he wanted a knight painted on one wall and spaceships on the other. That seemed like a weird mix to me, but if he liked it, I knocked on Alexander's door and was welcomed by a muffled, "Come in, Britt." As I stepped inside, I noticed how his usually tidy room was a complete mess. Clothes of his piled on the bed, and my own bags and boxes on the floor in the middle. That wasn't all. He had books and papers scattered around as if a whirlwind had come through. Currently, all I could see from my soulmate was his very scrumptious behind. He was kneeling on the floor by one of the walls, where the roof came sloping down. A panel had been removed to show storage space, and his entire upper body had disappeared inside. No wonder he'd sounded muffled. The sight of such an old vampire, one who'd glowed from the sheer power contained within, on his knees in the dust doing something very mundane. I couldn't hold back the laugh bubbling up inside me. "What are you doing?" A bang that made me wince. He'd obviously hit his head on something. And then he appeared completely, smoothly flowing to his feet, the image slightly spoiled by the hand rubbing a spot on his head and the cobwebs across his shoulders and hair. Stormy gray eyes met mine with a smile. "What does it look like?" You're making a huge mess," I offered, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind me. He crooked his finger in the universal come hither motion, and I shrugged and navigated my way through all the obstacles towards him. He met me halfway. "No, I'm cleaning to make space for your things," he said, a bemused look on his handsome face. When we reached each other, his hands immediately settled on my hips and tugged me in closer so he could hug me. "Doesn't look like it, and I don't think so. You're covered in dust," stepping sideways. I avoided his embrace. Even though my heartbeat sped up, he wanted to share his room. I hadn't realized I'd been worried about that so much until my body was flooded with relief and happiness at being so wanted by him. A mischievous look appeared in his stormy gray eyes. "No hug?" When I shook my head, he shifted his stance just the slightest bit. That was all the warning I got. Next thing I knew, I was cradled in his arms and then thrown across a wide shoulder. An arm wrapped around my legs, holding me in place while the other started tickling. Laughing and screaming for mercy, I pounded on his back, knowing I couldn't hurt him even if I tried. It was like hitting a brick wall, but I wasn't going to give up without a fight. He threw me on the bed and straddled me, still tickling me with way too fast fingers. "Changed your mind yet?" he asked, pausing his assault. I shook my head, wiping the tears from my eyes. "No way there's cobwebs in your hair." I tried to look disgusted, but the truth was, even with the silvery threads of spiderweb in his hair, it looked silky soft. My fingers itched to hold and pet and stroke. Alexander started tickling again, and I screamed, "Please, stop." He was laughing wickedly down at me, and when I started pushing him off and hitting his chest, he took my wrists with one hand and pinned them above my head effortlessly. "How about a kiss then?" he asked, leaning forward so his breath filtered across my face. I shivered at his gaze. Gone was the mischief, replaced by desire. He wore a look that told me he'd bring me nothing but pleasure if I agreed. I wanted to protest, out of principle, but I couldn't bring my mouth to talk. "Nothing to lose, a glamokoyi. You're just as dirty as I am now," he said, his voice husky. It made muscles low in my body clench in anticipation, a hot burning pooling low in my abdomen. He made the word dirty sound hot and sexy, dirty in an entirely different way. It had me forgetting all about cobwebs and dust. Arching my back and lifting my head, I managed to brush my lips against his. He responded by melding his lips against mine, letting go off my hand so he could brace himself on one arm. Even now, mindful not to crush me with his weight, his other hand he stroked down my body to claim possession of a breast, a growl coming from his lips. "Mine." His touch sent my nerve endings into sizzling overload. My back arching off the bed again, pressing my body further into his arms. I wanted to protest against his possessiveness. I was not an object he could own, but the growl had me moaning instead. I loved this possessive male too much to put up much objections anyway, not when he did wicked things like this to my body. Now that my hands were free, I trailed him down the smooth planes of his chest and then tugged at the hem of his shirt. "Off." His stormy gray eyes darkened at the words, and I wondered if he thought I was too forward. His next action took away the doubt. He sat up so that he was straddling me and smoothly took off the shirt, a dangerous smirk on his lips. "Better?" I nodded, biting my lips as I traced his chest with my eyes, loving the well-defined muscles and the soft, pale skin. White, but somehow infused with pink, it made him look touchable and alive instead of cold like a statue. He didn't move back down. Instead, he allowed me to look to my heart's content. An arrogant smirk on his face that told me he knew exactly what a sight he was. His fingers trailing softly across the exposed skin of my stomach, rubbing soft, infuriating circles that send hot spikes of pleasure and anticipation through me every time they reach just a little lower. "Do I get to take off your shirt too?" he wondered, pulling softly on the offending material. I knew I was blushing, but I bit my head and shook my head. What's in it for me? He looked downright devilish as he leaned in, close enough for his lips to brush mine as he spoke. "How about pleasure beyond your wildest imagination?" I had to bite back a moan as his words alone sent my body into overdrive. I felt so hot that I didn't even think twice about yanking my own shirt over my head, especially at the heated gaze he sent me before he trailed his eyes down to my chest, unashamed and totally possessive. "I'm going to bite you right here," he whispered huskily, trailing soft, teasing fingers over the heated skin of my left breast. Then, before I could utter a word, he leaned down and did just that, while his hands moved to stroke the other through my bra. moaning at the contact I gave into my earlier desire to stroke and pet and touch his hair, and did just that, sliding my fingers into the silky strands of coffee-colored hair, coffee or rich chocolate. Alexander, I sounded breathy and hoarse. They might hear us. The thought that my baby brother was just down the hall and might hear me moan was not appealing, and I was very sure I'd be moaning loudly in a short moment if I didn't stop him. A tongue teasingly flicked over my nipple, through the thin material of my bra, and I moaned loudly. "Oh, I'm sure Sarah can hear us," Alexander said, but he didn't sound in the least worried, his stormy eyes glancing up to look at me teasingly for a moment. I went to push at his shoulders, but I couldn't move him an inch. Instead, he rocked his body a little, so that the hard push of his arousal hit me at the seam of my legs, rubbing at the screamingly sensitive nerve ends there. "So sensitive, so responsive," he mumbled, sounding very pleased with himself as he repeated the motion, and I let out another breathy moan. "No need to worry a gramo croy. Sarah is the only one who can hear us, and she deserves that after what she made me listen to every night since she met Dennis." Alexander was grinning as he rocked his body again, grazing his lips across mine. I stopped pushing against his chest and instead ran my fingers down the smooth skin, raking my nails across just to get a reaction out of him. A husky growl as his body stiffened and I froze in my movements. "Did I do something wrong?" "Don't stop, Britt. That felt good," he ordered, and then he kissed me, nibbling softly on my bottom lip, trailing kisses across my jaw to that sensitive spot just below my ear, and then grazing his teeth across it before suckling softly. I knew that was going to be a hickey again, feeling delighted that I'd found something he obviously liked. I raked my nails across the skin of his back again, softly because I didn't want to hurt him, and he groaned and shivered. "I'm not made of porcelain, Britt." "Harder? This is vampire skin you're dealing with." He stopped what he was doing and just let me run my hands over the skin of his back, his eyes closing as he enjoyed it. He let me do that for several minutes, but I didn't mind. It felt amazing to touch him. I could do this for hours. He didn't move at all, becoming as still as a statue. Leaned forward as he was, with his weight braced on his arms on either side of my head. All I had to do was breath in deeply and my breasts would brush up against him. Suddenly he sat up and pinned my hands back down above my head. "Enough. You can pet me all you want tonight." Then, without further warning, he slid a hand down my body to boldly cup me between my legs. Shocked at the touch and the electrical currents it sends spiraling through me, I bit my lip. "Alexander?" It was meant to sound stern, but instead came out as another moan. With wicked fingers, he stroked me through my jeans until my eyes rolled back in my head and pleasure exploded inside me. Man was good on his word. He certainly knew how to bring pleasure. He slid off me, his legs over the edge over the bed as he pulled me into his lap to cradle me against him. "I love you, Brittany," he said huskily, his eyes still dark with lust and a spark in their depths. "I love you too," I told him, my voice unsteady because I was still trying to get my heart rate down and my breathing to even out. I was sure my eyes were all glazed over and hazy, sated as I felt. He chuckled warmly, showing me that male satisfaction again. He was very much pleased with the effect he had on me. We sat like that for a while, and then he suddenly put me down on the bed and pulled the edge of a blanket over me. "Rest for a while. You can watch me bring order to this so-called mess. I'm planning to keep you up late tonight." A darkly sensual look cast in my direction that promised me all kinds of wicked things he had in mind. I shivered, my body already responding in anticipation as he brushed his lips across my temple in a gentle kiss. It was nice to watch him work, especially because he hadn't bothered to put his shirt back on. He worked fast, too fast to be human, his hands blurring as he scrolled through stacks of papers. Sometimes it looked like he was even reading, but he moved things so fast that that was impossible. Within an hour, he had emptied half his closet, which had mostly been filled with some papers and boxes. Those had all disappeared by now, and most of his clothes had been placed back in the closet and his books back in order. On the bookshelves, there was precisely enough space there now for my own books. He held out his hand when he was satisfied to pull me off the bed, smirking as he noticed how I'd pulled his shirt on instead of my own. "There, now you can unpack." That was done so fast that it was almost sad. It looked like I had almost no clothes at all inside the half-empty closet next to Alexander's clothes. The man didn't even have that many things. I was left with the bag of knickknacks I'd salvaged from my mother's things, but I told Alexander to store that behind the panel in the wall too. I didn't feel up to going through that and giving it places. I only took the large seashell from it, the one that was beautiful red and gold and other colors that reminded me of the sunset. Mom and I had found it on the beach right next to our home, and I knew it would fit right in with the things Alexander had collected in his study. He understood my intent right away when I took it out, and he took my hand as he led me down the stairs. I heard no sounds coming from Andy's new room, but as we descended the stairs, I heard his laughter in the living, along with the sounds of a racing game. "There gram okroy," Alexander whispered in my ear as I placed the precious shell on a spot for display on one of the shelves in the study. "Beautiful. Will you tell me the story behind it?" With a smile, I did just that. My nightmares from this morning, all but forgotten. At long last, things were going perfectly. I had a beautiful man that loved me and would always be mine, and my baby brother finally had a home where he'd be loved. In the living, I found Andy playing with Bob and Dennis on the Wii. Kid was laughing so much that his cheeks were red and his eyes wide with mirth. Bob was laughing too. He wasn't even bothering to hide the fangs clearly visible. Shocked, I stared at that, stopping in my tracks. Alexander placed a warm hand on the small of my back and leaned down to my ear. "What's wrong, Britt?" Before I could reply, Andy jumped up and ran over to me, tackling my legs in a tight hug. "I love it here. I love it. I love everyone, Brittany Lee. Is this really gonna be home?" "Hell yes, this is home, giant," I told him as I ruffled his golden hair. "I'm glad you approve. You're not sad that it isn't just the two of us?" "Course I don't mind. Did you see that Bob has fangs? Isn't that cool? He says they're real." My brother bounced up and down in excitement before turning around and running back to the game console. "Play?" he offered, waving the controller at me. How could I resist? "We play for hours and ate pizza," Dennis ordered. Andy said nothing about the fact that Sarah, Bob, and Alexander didn't eat at all. Everyone felt happy and elated. Andy's smile was so very infective. When the doorbell rang, I thought nothing of it and got up to open the door. It was dark out and rain pelted down in hard, unrelenting force. On the doorstep stood a stunningly beautiful woman. Pale skin like the palest rose petals and flaming red hair that clung to her skull wetly in dark curls. She wore dark leather pants that clung to her like a second skin, and a leather corset that looked rebellious and sexy. She had eyes so pale that they were almost liquid silver. They looked at me shocked, as if she didn't expect to see me. Is this the Clitton house?" she asked, and her voice sounded sultry. This was a temptress, all right. She knew exactly how to get men to do what she wanted. No doubt about it. I nodded slowly. "Yes, who are you?" I didn't care that I sounded very rude. I just knew that I didn't like her. "Deidre." But it wasn't the woman that answered. It was Bob, and he sounded like he'd just seen a ghost. About 20 minutes later, I found myself seated on the couch in the living, cradling Andy against my side protectively. Alexander had his own arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, his posture tense as he stared at the red-haired woman as if she was a rattlesnake. Dennis was holding Sarah to him just as tightly, easily picking up on the tense atmosphere. Deirdre had asked for a moment to slip on dry clothes and had appeared downstairs to sit down in the large leather chair. She was now wearing a soft white dress and a towel wrapped around her shoulders to dry her hair. Bob stood across from her, his back turned to everyone as he stared out the window. All I knew was that Deirdre meant tears or sorrowful, and that this was in fact the woman that had made Bob a vampire. The woman he'd fallen in love with so very, very long ago. I didn't know if he'd seen her again after he'd made Alexander and Sarah. I didn't know the manner in which he'd left her to save his siblings, but I knew that it was hurting him a lot to see her again now. Did he still love this woman? I couldn't imagine this incredibly beautiful vampire loving anyone but herself. Even now, dressed so innocently as opposed to that dangerous look before, she looked like a woman very sure of herself, ready to wrap any man around her little finger. Jennifer and Stephanie could learn a lot from this woman. Andy shivered and looked up at me. "What is going on? Why is she so sad?" he whispered. But I knew everyone, but maybe Dennis could hear with their vampire ears. His eyes were so big and luminous that you could almost drown in them. "Sad?" I looked back at Deidre, but I couldn't see it. She looked composed and very put together, despite the wet hair and non-existent makeup. There was a soft smile playing on her lips, and her silver eyes looked cold and sharp. Not sad. I shrugged and offered, "Want to go play upstairs, giant?" "No." He shook his head in defiance. "I want to know why she's so sad. And I want to know why Bobby is sad too." I would have smiled at how Andy called Bob, but Alexander stiffened beside me at the words. When I looked up, I saw Bob look at my baby brother as well, a smoldering look on his face that I couldn't quite place. Sarah seemed very thoughtful, and I think she was talking telepathically to Alexander. The way her forehead had creased just a little bit, I didn't quite know how to respond to Hay because all the vampires in the room would hear what I said anyway. I wasn't sure I wanted that. Then the thought crossed my mind that Alexander thought I might have some talent in the telepathy department, so I gently reached out with my mind towards Andy. It wasn't easy because I didn't know exactly how to. With Alexander, it was all so very instinctive and easy, as if there was a line I could follow. But as I focused on the vibrant energy of my baby brother, I sent the thought, "Hey, I don't know why they are sad, but it's private. We shouldn't intrude. You know how you hate crying in front of other kids? So do they." I hoped he realized that it was me, and that I had in fact reached him. But I had no reason to worry because he suddenly started bouncing in excitement. "You can do that too, Brittany. Can you read my mind? What am I thinking right now?" Just like that, the tension in the room broke, although Deidre gave me a single piercing look as if she was surprised to find telepathy in a human. Everyone else but Bob was smiling at Andy with soft indulgence. I smiled at Hay and was about to say that I couldn't actually read minds, but was able to send thoughts to him when I realized he was in fact sending one to me. "Can I have cake, please?" Dennis made some. "Can I have it?" Shocked, I stared at him and then I smiled. "No, Hay, you're not getting cake. I'm sure Dennis will leave some for you for tomorrow. Besides, he makes cake all the time." "Oh, why not?" "It's chocolate cake." He pouted, but then he got up and seemed to have regained some sense. "Read my mind again." "Leah, it's so cool you can read minds and talk to me like this. I don't like it when they're sad. It makes my head heavy. Can I hug them? Will that make it better?" I shook my head. "I suppose you can hug Bob if you want." "What do you mean it makes your head heavy?" It surprised me how easy the telepathic communication between us was already, but I supposed it had to do with our blood relation. Andy didn't reply, however, and slipped out from under my arm to jump to his feet. Instead of going over to Bob for that hug, he turned and ran straight to Deidre. He'd climbed in her lap and slung his short arms around her neck in a death grip before she could even move. Although being a vampire, I suppose she could move real fast. Maybe she was just too shocked to actually move. "Andy," I said. "Bob." The words fell from my lips because I was rather shocked as well, and at that, Bob finally turned to face us. His blue eyes met mine, and I was startled to see that he no longer looked sad, but that a smile was tugging at his lips. It told me he appreciated the sentiment. Deidre was still frozen in Andy's arms, and suddenly, I was worried that she might not be able to restrain herself. Was she struggling to contain her bloodthirst? Does Andy have any more surprises up his sleeve? A gran McCoy. "Oh, don't worry. Deidre won't bite him. She's only lethal to grown men. She loves children." I shot Alexander a grateful look, happy that he'd guessed at the reason of the sudden tension in my body. I squeezed his hand more firmly than I would have with a human, but as he'd said earlier today, he was a vampire. "So it's only you I have to worry about?" I asked him, surprised to find the sudden playfulness inside me. I was only teasing because for some reason I couldn't explain. I had known the second Deidre walked in that she wasn't all that powerful as a vamp. Stronger then. Bob maybe. But Bob was at the very bottom, so that wasn't a surprise. But even Sarah was stronger compared to this pale but very beautiful woman. She was lethal only because she'd learned the art of seduction to perfection, I guessed. I knew I had nothing to worry about in that department. I might not be anywhere near as beautiful as she was, but Alexander was my soulmate. He would never love another. Never. Andy was still tightly hugging Deidre, and only now, after a few minutes, did I notice a change in her posture. Her body seemed to be relaxing, and then suddenly she'd gone from confident seductress to frail and lost. Then suddenly she started shaking, and then the woman wrapped her arms tightly around Andy. Not tight enough to hurt, but tight, so she pulled him close to her chest. Her head bent, at long last shielding a face devoid of emotion against Andy's tiny shoulder. My breath caught in my throat as I thought for a moment that she'd leaned down to feed, but then I realized she was crying, utterly heartbroken and so filled with sorrow that her name was a haunting fit. Andy was petting her hair as if he was trying to comfort her, humming a soft melody that I soon recognized as that of the Irish lullaby. I shouldn't be surprised that he'd picked it up after I sang it once. After all, I had two, words and all after hearing it only twice from Alexander. I think everyone was holding their breath and staring at what was happening. Bob was clenching his fists and gritting his teeth as if he itched to go over there and hug the woman. Something held him back, and when I saw his eyes, I knew that it was dark memories. Whatever had happened, they hadn't parted on friendly terms, and he wasn't able to forgive her for it. Not yet, at least, even though I could clearly see that he loved this woman. Somehow, after all these years, he still loved her. Since they'd almost died of the famine and disease, and Alexander had been an old-fashioned blacksmith, I knew they had to be at least 300 years old. After about 10 minutes, Deidre stopped crying and stopped hugging Andy so tightly. My baby brother let go of her neck at that moment too, and sat back on her lap to look the woman in the eye. He said something, but it was a whisper I couldn't hear. But Bob and Alexander both stiffened, and Sarah suddenly started smiling. Damn them and their vampire ears. I had another shock when Andy got up. Deidre's face wasn't wet from tears. It was blood that had streaked from her eyes and colored her cheeks crimson, staining even her dress and the blue collar of Andy's shirt. Her eyes were portals into her soul, and what I saw told me this woman was broken. So broken inside that she didn't know where her loyalties lay or how she was supposed to feel. But underneath that was a spine of steel because her voice was steady when she spoke. I came to warn you. Thornton is very mad at me, and he wishes to punish me by killing Bob. Thank you for the hospitality. She turned slowly to face Andy, cupping his face with a gentle hand. Thank you, Andy, child of an angel. Those last words had me gasping for air, my mouth dry and my throat suddenly tight. Why had she chosen to call him child of an angel? It was a stark reminder of the memory that had resurfaced last night. A memory that showed me he had been conceived not by an angel, but by a demon. Before I could pursue that train of thought, Deidre rose smoothly to her feet. I will leave now. I only came to warn you. I know Alexander will keep you safe. Seeing him tells me Thornton is no match for him. Then she turned around and walked out the door and straight out of the house. The front door fell shut with a definite bang that even to me sounded ominous. Andy seemed ultra-sensitive to the mood in the room. Everyone seemed to be turned inwards as they remembered things or thought over the strange warning the vampire Deidre had brought us. Okay, I think we all need cake now. The boy had a smug look on his face that told me he knew exactly what he was saying. Sneaky kid. I'll go get it. I shook out of Alexander's grasp to hurry after Hay as he ran to the kitchen with a giggle. Andy, I said no, and only Dennis eats. You're one sneaky boy. I caught him round the middle before he reached the door and picked him up. It's that I love you so much. Andy smiled up at me, and then his eyes shifted to look behind me at the room. As I looked over my shoulder, I saw that everyone was smiling, even Bob, although it looked a little strained. Wow. I realized immediately that it had in fact been Andy's intent all along to lighten the mood. He really was the most amazing little brother ever, and I felt bad that he was the one that was cheering up all the adults now. I shifted him in my hold so that I could balance him on my hip. You know, hey, you're the most amazing boy ever. Just for that, you can get a piece of cake, okay? You promised to go to bed after that? He nodded happily, and I had no problem passing him on to Dennis as he appeared beside me. I'll have some of that cake too, come hey? I let the door close on them and returned to the three vampires. How serious is this threat to Bob's life? I asked when I reached them. Their smiles were all gone, and Bob had returned to staring out of the window, his form rigid. It was quiet a moment, and then Alexander said, It's no threat at all. I can kick Thornton ass any day. It surprises me that he thinks he can threaten Bob. I suppose he's grown arrogant and conceited now that he's held his territory for 100 years without any power struggles. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised at the cold tone of his voice. He sounded and looked every inch the hard, badass vampire that I'd seen, infused with so much power that he'd lit up like a Christmas tree last night. I had no trouble believing him when he said Thornton was no match. Except that when I looked at Sarah, she looked so worried that my stomach plummeted to my toes. You sure, Alexander? I didn't want to doubt him, but I sure as hell didn't want him to get hurt. I'm sure I can beat him, Alexander replied curtly, his eyes intense. He held out one hand in an obvious demand for me to go to him. I wondered if he wanted to hold me for his sake or mine. Deciding to ignore him despite the very needy part of me that yearned to be skin to him at every opportunity. Instead, I skirted around the coffee table, making sure to stay out of his reach, and walked over to Bob. I told Hay to hug you. He wanted to hug you and her, but I guess he thought she needed it more, I said as I wrapped my arms around Bob's waist. Fleetingly, I wondered why both Clittons had to be so bloody tall. Bob was tense for a short moment, but then he softened. Thank you, Brittany, he whispered as he brought up his arms and wrapped them around me. His head came down so his chin rested on top of mine. I heard some sort of growl coming from behind me, and I knew that was Alexander. Then Sarah laughed as she said, "Oh, stop it, Alex. She's your mate, and Bob's your brother. Get over it." I twisted a tiny bit so I could glance back and see what was going on, and it made me smile. Alexander had a very dark expression on his face as he glared at Bob. I couldn't believe he was going all possessive over the fact that I was hugging his brother. I couldn't help myself. I stuck out my tongue at him. His face was priceless. He looked shocked, and then he frowned. "Brittany, remember what I said about petting this afternoon? I take it back." He looked smug, as if he thought that would punish me for teasing him. "Your loss? You're the one that likes it so much," I said with a grin. Bob let go off me. "Go to Alex, you're driving him insane." He smiled softly as he said it, so I let go off him and stepped back. Instead of going to Alexander, I sat down beside Sarah, enjoying the annoyed growl that erupted from his throat just a little too much to resist the temptation of further teasing him. Bob's next words, however, destroyed that playful illusion. "Alex, I know you can beat Thornton in a fair fight, but that's the thing, we both know Thornton knows that too, so he's not going to risk a fair fight. He's going to lure you in a trap somehow, stab you in the back." Alexander was looking at me when he replied, his voice firm and unafraid. "I know, Bob, but we've been forewarned." When he held out his hand again for me, I stood up and sat down beside him, allowing him to pull me into his lap. I'd figured out that it wasn't for my sake that he wanted to hold me, but his. It scared me to know that, behind the confident facade, he seemed to want the reassurance of holding me. It made me wonder just how bad this Thornton guy was. There's also the possibility that Deidre showing up here was a ploy of his. "He might be making a play for your territory, Alex," Bob said with cold, clipped words. It shook me that he could think so badly of this woman he appeared to love. Alexander was even nodding. I considered that, but if so, it was without Deidre's knowledge. "Yes, Bob, she is convinced she did the right thing," Sarah said. It was a helpless effort to defend the red-headed woman that I'd so instantly judged as a person I could never like. I was wondering about that now, though. Andy had always been a very good judge of character, much better than I was. He wouldn't hug a woman he didn't like, especially not one he didn't know either. He was always so shy around strangers, although it was mostly kids his age that scared him. Alexander sounded cold again when he said, "You should not defend that woman, Sarah. She might have come here because she didn't want Bob to die, but that doesn't take away the fact that she is the reason Thornton wants Bob dead in the first place." "Yes," Bob nodded. "She probably pissed him off royally and he's aiming for her weakness." Me. Sarah took on a stubborn look. "And have you thought about why you are her weakness, Bob?" "Because she loves you, even if she doesn't show it." Bob shocked us all by throwing his head back and laugh, a sound devoid of humor, making it mocking. It gave me shivers, and involuntarily I flinched back into Alexander's warm, solid chest. He squeezed his arm around my waist, holding me there. "No, Sarah, that woman loves no one but herself." Then Bob turned around and stalked out of the room. I could faintly hear him slam his bedroom door a short moment later. "I'll talk to him, Sarah," Alexander offered quietly. It was clear that Sarah looked a little crestfallen and sad. She seemed to be the only one who believed that whatever love there was between Bob and Deidre was salvageable. "No, don't bother. I don't even know why I still try," Sarah said, her tone a little acerbic. I had never heard her talk that way before. "I don't know either, Sarah. That woman certainly doesn't deserve it," Alexander replied, and I had the feeling all of this was a long, ongoing thing between the three siblings. probably ever since they'd all become vampires. Sarah pinned Alexander with a solemn look. She might not, Alex, but Bob certainly does. With those words, she stood up and left the room as well. I wanted to turn around so I could see Alexander's expression. But just then, Danis and Andy appeared. I'm ready for bed, Brittany. I nodded and freed myself from Alexander's grasp. Sarah might need you, Danis. I think I hurt her feelings. I apologize, Alexander said, meeting the angelic-looking guy with a level stare. Without saying a word, he turned and ran from the room. I'm sorry, hey, come, I'll read you a story. I wasn't sure what I was apologizing to Andy for, but I knew it couldn't be nice for him to be in the middle of all this tension on his first night here. I wanted this to be perfect and happy, but all we got was one afternoon. I had to climb into the castle bed with Hay when I read him the story, and as I left, he said bravely, You can turn off the light, Brittany. I'm not scared here. I have a castle now. When I turned off the light, he added softly, Daddy can't hurt me here. He won't find me. I was shocked as I closed the door, numbly reassuring him that I was right down the hall and that I'd come if he called. Had that bastard off a father really hurt Andy at night? Or was he talking about his real father, the demon that I could now clearly remember? Are you all right, Agramokroe? Alexander said the moment I stepped into his bedroom. Well, I guess it was our bedroom now. I looked up from my feet to look at the man I was going to share a bed with. The man that I'd fallen in love with the moment I met him, and the man that I had just moved in with even though I'd only known him for a little over 2 weeks. He was sprawled out on the bed, dressed only in a pair of loose sweats that clung low on his hips. In the lighting, his skin looked faintly golden, and he looked downright edible, the way the muscles on his chest were defined. If it weren't for that nearly lethal aura he possessed, he could have stepped right out of a magazine as a male model. But no model could look as dangerous as he could. Brittany? He prompted me when I still hadn't answered his question. Not that he minded that much by the smirk on his lips. He liked that I had been staring. Fighting the blush that wanted to color my cheeks red, I nodded. Yes, I'm okay. It's just that Andy said something. Alexander arched a brow in question as he crooked a finger. Come here, Britt. Let me get my PJs first, I told him. I took them out of the wardrobe that still looked pitifully empty on my side, and then hurried to the ensuite bathroom. I ignored the faintly amused look on his face. It was clear he thought I should just change into them right there in front of him. In the bathroom, I quickly changed and then brushed my teeth. After a look in the mirror, I decided to give my hair a brush too. I hated how it always got so easily tangled. It wasn't that I had particularly curly hair, but it never stayed in place. Frowning as I thought over the words Andy had last uttered, I walked back into the bedroom a few minutes later. What did he mean with it? I couldn't let it rest. Tomorrow I'd have to carefully ask Hay what he meant. Somehow, the thought that my father had been visiting him at night was almost as unappealing as the thought that Andy's real birth father had been visiting him. A demon or an abusive man? I nearly screamed when I bumped into something hard, warm, and very solid on my way over to the bed. A pair of arms wrapped around me and a soft chuckle vibrated against me. You are very lost in thought, Alexander said as he picked me up and carried me the last bit to the bed. There he deposited me on the soft mattress and folded his arms across his chest as he looked down at me. I had to swallow twice before I could clear the sudden tightness in my throat, and I didn't even try to fight my blush this time. Those sweats hung way too low on his hips to be legal, showing me that V-dip that accentuated his hip bones. A soft trail of golden hairs that led down to lower regions. Somehow, I just couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My eyes are up here, Britt, he said, sounding a little husky and a whole lot amused. At that, I yanked my eyes up to his face, meeting his stormy gray orbs to see that they darkened to near black, something I'd come to recognize as a symbol for very strong emotions. I'd seen them darken in anger, but mostly in lust so far. I hadn't looked up nearly fast enough, already having glimpsed the bulge in his crotch. He seemed completely unashamed about it, though. You're mean, I told him as I hurriedly crawled underneath the blankets, hoping that it would hide my own embarrassment. I wasn't used to this. How could he be so open and confident about all these things? Then again, he was over 300 years old. He'd had plenty of time to get used. How so? He asked as he lifted one of his eyebrows again. He'd thrown himself down on the bed beside me, on top of the blankets, but still close enough for me to feel his body heat. Instead of answering, I asked, How come you're warm? He laughed. Why wouldn't I be a Gramokroe? I frowned as I thought about how to phrase my question. He told me himself he died sometime during the change, so that meant he was some sort of undead, wasn't he? Besides, a lot of vampire myths said they were cold. Luckily, Alexander seemed to have picked up on my trail of thoughts. We're predators, Britt, but we hunt humans, not animals. Superior strength and speed are not a given for our race. Warmth and charisma are. Tell me, would you trust a cold person? Would you like it to step into the embrace of someone as cold as a grave? I shivered at the thought, then shook my head. Of course not. That's why we're warm, to give humans a false sense of safety. Vampires also thrive on sex. It's in our nature. A cold embrace might be overlooked, but no one has sex with a corpse. No one sane, at least. Vampires thrive on sex? Really? I swallowed as my gaze automatically swept down his body, my face heating up as I realized what I was doing. Unbidden thoughts floating into my mind about licking that delicious skin, following that trail of tiny hairs with my fingers. At Alexander's husky chuckle, I managed to snap my thoughts away from that topic and to safer grounds. Shit, had he been reading my mind? Or was I accidentally projecting them? I really had to ask him to work on that. Maybe he had some advice on those shields I'd tried out Friday night. So, what did Andy say that had you thinking? Alexander asked curiously. It seemed he'd decided to give me a break. He'd gotten under the duvet. He lifted his arm and tugged me against him. I didn't resist. It felt amazing to curl into his side, my head on his chest and one of my legs entangled with his. It felt so safe with his arm wrapped around me. Of course, tonight had once again shown me that he was one of the most powerful vampires in the region at the moment. Even this Thornton guy wasn't as strong as Alexander, so it was perfectly logical that I felt safe. Breathing out happily, I focused my thoughts on the present and the words Andy had said, repeating them for Alexander. Are you certain that's what he said? Alexander asked. At my nod, he cursed, or at least I assumed that's what he did, but I wasn't certain because he'd done so in Gaelic. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have played nice with him this morning. Damn it, Britt. If he's touched Andy. He didn't finish his sentence, but the threat rang clear in the silence. Of course. I hadn't told him about the resurfaced memory, the one that told me we didn't have the same dad. Oh, I said stupidly, and then I frowned. How could I tell him this? I didn't want him to hate Andy, but he had a demon as a father. How could people not hate him if they knew? Brittany, you're holding something back. Don't tell me he really has touched Hay. Did you know? Alexander's voice sounded cold with suppressed fury. His arm around my shoulders crushed me too. His hand clenched tightly in my hair. I shivered and shook my head, touched that he was so furious about something possibly done to my baby brother, but also cold inside at the thought that he wouldn't feel the same anymore if he knew Andy was half demon. I still couldn't quite add the things up in my mind. Andy's laughing face, his golden curls and eyes, the strong empathy he always showed, and the deep-rooted need in him to always make sure everyone was all right. It was nothing like a demon, right? Or was my idea of a demon wrong? Just like my ideas about vampires hadn't been correct, the image of the one demon I'd seen resurfaced, and I shivered. The red eyes and the evil smile, now awake. I could look at the memory with a more rational mind. The demon hadn't been bad-looking. In fact, he'd looked like a stunningly handsome man. It had been the red eyes, the look in them that had warned me he was evil, told me what he was. Brittany, Alexander suddenly snapped, pushing me back and rolling on top of me, his weight supported by one hand, while the other clutched my shoulder tightly. Shocked, I blinked at him. What? What is going on? You're hiding something. I want to help. I need to help, but I can't if you don't tell me what's going on, he said, his voice a half growl, although he appeared to be making the effort to sound somewhat civil. Don't talk to me that way, I heard myself say. I sounded so defensive, and it wasn't what I wanted, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. To tell Alexander Hay and I didn't have the same father? Alexander's eyes darkened dangerously, and I felt a humming in the air. A second after that, his skin started to glow as his power rose to the surface. There was no trace of the warm, erotic touch like last time, just pure lethal power. I guess I managed to get him mad. Still, I wasn't afraid. Alexander would never hurt me. That was simply an absolute truth. Oh, stop that. You're not going to hurt me, I scoffed, pushing at his chest even though my muscles felt like jelly. My heart and mind weren't scared, but the basic survival instinct in me was flooding my system with adrenaline, my heart pounding in my throat. You are scared, he accused, and instead of toning it down, his power seemed to amplify. His hair ruffled by a breeze. I could neither see or feel. I'm not. But I can't suppress my instincts. Now stop it, there's no need for this. You just have to accept that some things need time. I'll tell you when I'm ready, I said, pushing at him again, but he didn't budge. I forced myself to meet his stare without flinching. Somehow I knew that if I backed down now, he'd unintentionally walk all over me again next time we had an argument. I didn't mind. Fighting with Alexander was almost as exhilarating as kissing him was. Suddenly his power was gone. It snapped into him so quickly that it had my ears ringing. Still angry, he rolled off me with a growl and then, to my utter surprise, folded his arms across his chest to sulk. Yes, sulk. Who knew Alexander Clitton, vampire extraordinaire, sulked? It was so absurd that I resolved into a fit of giggles. You're cute when you sulk. He looked up and met my eyes again with a frown. I am not sulking, Brittany. I'm a vampire. As if being a vampire automatically meant you didn't sulk? I laughed. Then, what do you call this? He seemed to contemplate about that for a moment before he replied, I'm thinking. Right. His face softened as he looked at me. You're right, Agramokroy. I should respect it if you do not wish to tell me something. Forgive me. Pleased that he'd agreed on that, and incredibly relieved that I did not have to tell him the awful truth about Andy's birth just yet. I scooted closer to him again and pressed my lips softly against his. Forgiven. He tugged my against his side again just like before, and we lay in silence for a while. Only a little tense because I could feel the questions inside of him. He wanted so badly to know what was on my mind so he could help me. I felt bad for hiding the truth from him, especially when he whispered, I only wanted to know why you're worried about Andy. I want to help, he's your brother, and because of that, he's also mine. I protect what's mine, Brittany. You know, Alexander. I'm sorry, and then before I could stop myself, it's just that I remembered something this morning, something I'd forgotten. We don't have the same father. Alexander, Henry Baker is not Andy's real father. I sat up quickly and stared at him. Did you just use your powers to make me say that? Alexander was frowning but slowly shook his head. I'm hurt, Britt. I would never do that to you. I nodded. I guess. I just didn't actually mean to say that. Alexander, you don't seem surprised? He sat up as well and cradled my face in his hands. I'm not a gramokoye. At least I'm not surprised that Henry Baker isn't Andy's father. He looked down as he thought for a moment, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed once. But I don't think you and Andy have different fathers. Your scent, your mental pattern, it's too much alike. I was already shaking my head in denial, pulling back from his hands. No, you're wrong. That can't be true. Why would my father say he is, if he isn't related by blood? Why would he take us in? He cares only about status and money. It makes no sense. More so, I didn't want to share the same father with Andy now that I knew it was a demon. That would mean I was half demon too. I didn't want to be something evil. Unless he got paid to do it, Britt, Alexander said, and I couldn't deny that that was a definite possibility. No, it couldn't be true. I wouldn't not believe it. What proof did Alexander have anyway? Just a scent? A mental pattern? I'm sorry, Britt, come, Alexander said, sounding genuinely sorry and a little worried. He tugged me into his embrace tightly, falling back down on the mattress so I was flush on top of him. Much like the way I woke up here the first time. I didn't mean to shock you like that. He hesitated a moment, his hand curling into my hair. I saw something in Mr. Baker's mind when I convinced him to sign the papers. Curious, albeit a little anxious, I shifted my face so I could press it into the crook of his neck, the tip of my nose skimming over his skin. Delighted by the goosebumps that appeared, I said, What did you see? A moment of silence, and then he seemed to get his voice back. Oh, I saw the memory of him talking with your mother. You look so much like her that I just knew that was her. Your mother seemed upset, and she was already very pregnant. She asked him to say the child was his. My fist clenched on his chest. You saw that in his mind? His hand softly started stroking my back, a soothing motion. Yes, that's what I saw. She was holding a very heavy envelope that he took. He didn't look into it, but I know he knew there was something very valuable in it. Oh, I guess it does make sense. I tried to make light of it. I suppose I should be happy I'm not related to that scumbag. Only I kept thinking that the one I really was related to then was much, much worse. Alexander laughed softly. I suppose you could say that. I love you, Britt, no matter what your heritage is. That goes for Andy too now. It was exactly the right thing to say, of course. He set his mind open and flooded mine with warmth and love, showing me how much he meant those very words. Of course, it also made me feel a little drowsy. So, what did I do to convince my father? Mr. Baker? I suppose I shouldn't keep lying to myself by calling him father. Alexander stilled, completely underneath me. He wasn't even breathing, although I suppose he didn't really have to breath, being a vampire and all. Then he laughed again. Maybe you'll permit me this one secret? One secret, you say? I smiled. You have more secrets than any person I know. If you hadn't said vampires thrive on sex, I would have said they thrive on secrets. Well, agramokroy. We sort of thrive on both. A subtle movement of his hips underneath me that made me very aware of the position we were in. If it weren't for secrecy, humankind would have hunted and killed us all by now. I suppose, I muttered. Then for some reason I had to ask, you didn't hurt him, did you? I didn't mean to hurt him, Brittany, he replied. I could almost hear the word unfortunately after that sentence. His mind was weak. Most people consumed with greed was his explanation. We were both quiet for a while, and I felt my head getting heavier with sleep. Alexander's even breathing was very comforting and relaxing, especially now that the tension had finally left his body. When I was almost asleep, he softly asked, does Andy know who his real father is? Was he talking about Henry Baker or his birth father when he said, Daddy can't hurt me here? I shivered. That was exactly what I'd been worried about as well. I don't know, I answered truthfully. I had asked myself that question before, but I really didn't know the answer to that. It seemed telepathy ran in the family because Andy had already talked to me that way. Who knows? Maybe he'd picked something up somehow. Combined with his strong empathy, it wasn't unlikely, I supposed. The thought that a demon was the one visiting him at night, how had he been getting into the house? Would moving here keep him from doing it again? Did I have to tell Alexander about it? I suppose I was obligated to tell him it was a demon that might be visiting his house. All right, let's leave worrying for tomorrow. A gramokroy. Sleep, he whispered. I wanted to protest, but he started humming that lullaby softly. It was so enchanting to listen to that I didn't interrupt, and soon I felt myself drifting off. At the last moment, I felt a wave of fear crash over me. It was inevitable with all this talk about memories and heritage that banished nightmare memories would claim me. Tick, tack, tick, 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 tick. Mom? My voice quivered when I spoke. Auburn curls plastered to my scalp, and my white summer dress clung wetly to my tiny 10-year-old body. I had run home straight through the pouring rain because I wanted to make sure Mommy was all right. Mommy hadn't been herself lately, ever since the bad man had visited, the man that made her cry and hurt her. I stepped softly into the white, airy bedroom with the long, beautiful drapes around the bed. Mom said they made her feel like an Arabian princess, like Scheherazade. My toes sunk into the soft white carpet as I padded across the room to the bed. I'd already spotted the dark shape lying partially underneath the duvet, and I knew it was Mom. Her hair normally golden and glowing, now a tangled mess across the pillow. Mom, are you awake? Tentatively, I reached out and pulled aside the white gauzy curtain. Just as I reached out to touch my mother, she stirred, muttering in her sleep. A sleep riddled with nightmares by the painful expression on her angelic face. No, you have to leave, she suddenly screamed. She sat up in bed so fast that our heads nearly collided. But Mommy, I started confused, but her eyes weren't focused on me, but something in the far distance. Leave? I asked, reaching out to touch her shoulder, my hand tiny and pale, trembling because I was cold from the rain, water dripping down from my dress to pool around my ankles on the carpet. Mom's shoulder was cold and wet too, but it was wet from cold sweat. You have to leave. Brittany is coming home soon. I know you want nothing from her. Come back tonight. Just not my baby, please? My mom was pleading to someone unseen now. My 10-year-old mind didn't understand. I was already here. What was she talking about? No. A single anguished scream tore from her chest, and then she was saying in a rush, I already gave you a child. It's not my fault she doesn't have the gene. At that moment, the fog of confusion lifted from my own mind, and I realized she was reliving the moment in the kitchen. The moment just before I came home and found that demon. The day my mom's light had gone out. Her words didn't make sense though. Had she given the demon a child? Sometimes I really hated being the smartest in class. She was talking about me. She'd given me to the demon, but he didn't want me? Mom, wake up. You have to wake up. Mommy, please? I asked, shaking her arm. I had to be strong again for the both of us. I had to make the demons in her dreams leave too. Suddenly, I felt warm inside. So very warm. It was a good kind of warm, and it was building. Getting stronger, like a hot and live thing beating inside of me. I didn't understand what it was, but I knew. If I touched Mom now, if I could reach her through the fog of her mind, I could banish them all. All the demons and bad dreams that tormented her. Just a touch, and they would be gone forever. Confident the way only a 10-year-old could be with things like these, I reached out and touched my mother's forehead. She jolted away from the touch, as if burned, so I had to grab her shoulder and climb onto the bed. Trying again, struggling with Mom's agonized form, weak and limp from days spent in bed with too little sustenance. Then my hand was firmly pressed against her forehead and a blinding flash of light erupted from our joined skin. A moment later, I was on the other side of the room, sprawled out on the carpet while my mind scrambled around to try and comprehend what had happened. A voice sounded in the room. You'll regret this, angel boy. You'll regret this. The last thing I saw was a dark shape looming over my mother's prone form on the bed. Dark red eyes shining with an evil glint. My hand automatically reached out and another flash of blinding light bathed the room pure white. Then everything went black. Brittany? Damn it, wake up, a voice said. Wake up. I realized it was Alexander as I slowly drifted out of the blackness. It felt like swimming through murky water before I finally managed to lift my eyelashes and open my eyes. When I opened them, I saw it was still somewhat dark in the room. Alexander's face loomed above me and his hands were gently shaking my shoulders. Britt, come on, snap out of it. My tongue felt like rubber in my mouth when I tried to speak. I had to swallow twice before any sound came out. Hey, even my voice sounded croaky, as if I hadn't had any water for days. Finally, he whispered, and then he pulled me up and into his embrace, cradling me tightly against his chest. I thought you'd never wake up. He sounded so worried, and if I didn't know any better, I would have thought he'd almost panicked when I didn't wake up immediately. It was instinctive now to reach out to him with my mind, sending him soothing emotions. It felt a lot easier to talk to him this way, so I asked mentally, I'm okay, what's wrong? I was only sleeping. Alexander shuddered and then replied, No, not just sleeping, you were completely quiet, Britt. I woke because I felt nothing from you. Empty, quiet. He didn't actually think it, but I heard what he meant with it, as if I was dead. He'd been terrified for a moment, not just panicked. I was dreaming. And then I blacked out in my dream, I said, and my voice sounded very strange in the quiet darkness around us. I lifted my arm and it felt shaky and weak, but I still managed to place my hand with the palm on his cheek. I'm okay now. I tried to sound confident and email Alex a calm aura. Nothing was wrong. I was only remembering in my dream. After a moment, he lay back down with me, holding me tightly to his chest. Will you tell me about your dream? What on earth was so powerful that your spirit went into hiding in the furthest quiet recess in your mind? I had to think back, and for a moment my head swam. The memory of my dream was clear in my head now. The memory that proved I'd known all along, that I too had that demon as a father. Andy and I shared the same heritage. I remembered something else. I saw my mom in bed, she was having a nightmare, and she was talking out loud. It was very confusing at the time. I guess that's why I buried the memory. I was quiet for a moment while I let my words sink in. Those flashes of light I remembered, and the demon screaming, You'll regret this, angel boy. What did that mean? The light had come from me, but had he been talking to someone else? The angel that fell in love with my grandmother when she was young? Alexander quietly asked. Did you remember what she was saying? It doesn't sound bad enough to me to cause this. Why did you black out in the memory? I shrugged. There were some flashes of light when I touched Mom, That's when I blacked out. Do you really think I have angel blood in me? Show? Yes. I'm sure a grandma Koyi, your grandfather must have been an angel. He chuckled. They're immortal, you know? Maybe you'll get to meet him one day. How about demons? Do they exist too? I asked, hoping he wouldn't catch the lie. Of course, I already knew they existed, but I needed to know how he felt about them. Maybe if I knew that I could gauge his reaction if I told him I was half demon. Of course demons exist too. They're not from hell though, just like angels. They dwell among humans. We only call them that because it fits with the legends humans make about these kind of creatures. There's a lot of different demons though. Some even consider vampires demons. Really? I suppose I could understand that. After all, they did prey on humans to feed from their blood. To humans that must appear to be evil. Yes, he sounded solemn as he said, demons are often mean and twisted. They only care for themselves, and they'll try to trick you in any way they can. Oh, have you ever met a demon? I ventured to ask. The clock on the nightstand told me it was 7 a.m. I suppose that was a little early to get up on a Sunday, but I felt clammy from my dream, so I pulled back the blanket and sat up. Where are you going? Alexander asked instead of answering my question. Shower? I feel like I need one, I said as I stood up. He grabbed my hand and pulled it to his mouth, taking a deep breath as if he was smelling me. You smell delicious to me, Britt, he said, confirming my suspicion. My cheeks still heated up as I replied, You're biased, just as I was about to close the bathroom door behind me. Alexander said, Yes, I've met plenty of demons in my life. You have nothing to fear of them. They amass power the same way as vampires do. I can kick pretty much any demon's ass anytime. Really? He could? Did that mean he could send the demon that was my father away if he really came looking for Andy? I didn't realize how scared of him visiting this house I'd been until I felt the sudden tension fall away from me. Alexander was a very powerful vampire. He could kick anyone's ass anytime. I had no reason to be afraid. Cocky, I said teasingly. Leave the door open, a gramo choi, Alexander called after me. Horvert. I just want to make sure you don't slip into your mind again. That was very unsettling. I won't peek if you don't want me to. His voice clearly reflected how much he really had been worried, and just because of that, I nodded and left the door unlocked. Of course, his last words left me with the clear impression that he really did want me to invite him along. My damned body was betraying me when it started humming with need at the clear invitation in his eyes that I'd glimpsed just before I closed the door. I was cleared Balling's offices with Con Brown. I was collective up in a big chair in Alexander's study. He lit the big fireplace for me and opened all the curtains and the French doors to let in fresh air and the scent of the flowers blooming in the garden. Dennis had brought me a big plate filled with all kinds of snacks and a steaming cup of hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows floating on top, while Sarah had actually shown up with a book that I absolutely had to read, according to her, which was what I was currently engrossed in. It was a story written by a shapeshifter apparently, and as such it contained a lot of information about the supernatural world. It was a romance of some sort, and when Alexander saw it, he looked somewhat amused and said, If you want to know about that sort of things, you could have just asked me. He had left me alone though, and instead worked at his desk for a few hours and made phone calls in strange languages that I couldn't understand. Or he'd just talk English, but he'd talk in work jargon that I couldn't understand either. A few chapters into the book, my ears were burning and I realized what he'd meant with his words about the book. Although a lot was explained about how shapeshifters, witches, and vampires, amongst other creatures, acted and functioned in the human world, most of this book was filled with sex scenes that made me blush red from head to toe. Why the hell did Sarah tell me to read this? Did she think I needed help in the bedroom department? I was starting to really believe that vampires thrived on sex. Sarah sure as hell seemed to confirm it. Worse was that every time I came across another scene and my face would heat up, Alexander would chuckle. The first time I'd looked up shocked and he'd said, Heartbeat agroma koi. I can feel your heat. I had almost put the book away until I realized that that was exactly why he'd said it. In fact, it looked like he wanted me to get up and go over to him. So I'd turned my back on him and continued reading. Bad move, because his eyes smoldering into the back of my head was even worse. Just after lunch, which Danis had brought in, Alexander left because he wanted to spend some time with Andy. I was both happy and relieved, but still vowed to give Sarah a piece of my mind about why she'd given me this book. I was a virgin, and sure, I did wonder about some things, but did she really have to give me a book about it? 1. Alexander seemed to know too. How embarrassing. Japanese. There days the stains. After an HD% of basically sage and H% of Asians and odd of vaseability. There Sadra of last and texting counts of H%. There Sadra of actually be give up. I wasn't getting anything done to satisfaction, and she blatantly refused to come over and ease my suffering. I really couldn't understand why she was reading that book when she could have asked me about such things. Did Sarah put her up to it, or was she really so uncomfortable to talk to me? At least about such matters? I couldn't deny the fact that she'd definitely been skirting around certain subjects last night. She was hiding something. It hurt to think that she didn't trust me enough to tell. Even this morning, she didn't tell me everything about her dream and then just changed the subject by asking me questions. What could she be hiding? I had reached Andy's room now, so I forcefully stuck all my worries and frustrations about Britt into an iron box in my mind. I'd take the time later to re-examine everything. I wasn't going to go easy on her when she was done reading that book. Taking a deep but very unnecessary breath, I knocked on the door. I could hear the boy playing with toys inside, chattering happily to both Sarah and Danis. Andy's heartbeat was slower than that of the witch for some reason. It was something I'd noticed before but never paid much attention to. Now it struck me as odd. Usually younger children had faster heartbeats, but Andy's heart sounded like that of a full-grown man who was very Alex about sports. The heart was, after all, a muscle you could train too, and it was common knowledge that people that play sports intensively gained bigger and stronger hearts. Their heartbeat slowing as a result to that. I knew several vampires who liked blood from this type of people above all other types, which reminded me about the silly belief that vampires would prefer one blood type over another. As if something so small would alter the taste of it. Only diets and health change the taste of blood. Come in, Andy yelled excitedly, and I could hear him jump up and down when I opened the door. Hey, I need your help for a moment, kid, I told him, smiling encouragingly at him, but also intentionally showing him my fangs. Okay, he said happily. I wanted to frown suspiciously. He seemed a little too happy right now, almost as if he was trying to convince everyone that he was, while he was hiding his fears and worries. I allowed my own senses, both natural and unnatural, to stretch out fully. It caused Sarah to frown, and even Danis perked up, but they both quickly excused themselves and left. What do you need help with, Alexander? Andy asked, and he sounded old for his young years. It saddened me. Children should always be allowed to be children for as long as possible. Yet Andy was carrying around a heavy burden, one even Brittany didn't seem to know much about. It was time to change that. Let's sit down, I told the boy as I folded my legs and sat down on the plush blue carpet. Alexander wasn't there during dinner, but we had fun with the 5 of us anyway. Andy was incredibly happy and a little hyper, and he seemed really peaceful at the same too, as if his mind had been completely set at ease. I guessed that had something to do with what he'd talked about with Alexander. All Andy had wanted to tell me was that Alexander was very nice, and that he was really happy we were living here now. I suppose I had to ask Alexander what he'd told the boy. After dinner, I'd taken Andy to bed and read him story after story, curled up together on that huge castle bed of his. He was asleep around 8 though, and he appeared to be in a deep sleep too, softly snoring. Feeling a little anxious for Alexander to come home, I went back downstairs after that and joined Bob and Danis in the living. Already I was starting to feel a little tense again, that imaginary rope stretching out between me and Alexander. If I was feeling it then, so was he. Of course, so I really hoped he wouldn't stay away for much longer. Nobody seemed to even know where he'd gone, but I didn't want to sound too clingy or needy by asking. To my great surprise, Bob and Danis were avidly watching some kind of vampire show on TV. I'd never heard of it, but they were laughing at all the wrong places because it was so far from the truth, something even I could recognize now. I'd just sat down to watch as well when Sarah popped up behind me and leaned over the back of the couch with a frown on her face. You know, there's one thing I never understood. If humans think we're cold-blooded, then how the hell would a vamp get an erection? She asked. Her head tilted sideways and a frown on her forehead as if she was really wondering about the answer. Danis looked at his mate with one eyebrow raised. You think about the weirdest things, sweetie? But Bob was frowning as he contemplated the answer. Good question. If they're cold-blooded, maybe they work the same way as other cold-blooded creatures. Like reptiles? No way, Bob. I don't see those vamps sitting around in the sun for hours just to warm up, I exclaimed, shaking my head at the absurdity of the conversation. Who talks about fake vampires and the way they get an erection with real vampires? Well, they're nearly indestructible anyway. Nothing is going to stop them, it seems, offered Danis. But I shook my head as I realized Sarah's dilemma. No, because you need your heart to pump blood into the organ, and without a heartbeat, how's that going to happen? You raise a fair point, my dear. Bob nodded. Shall I know? Sarah said suddenly, looking really smug, as if she'd thought of something great. They must work the same way as sea creatures. And how exactly is that if you're so smart? Danis asked, frowning a little, as if he was expecting something really silly to come out of her mouth next. Sea creatures get erections from krill and saline water. Fact. Those vamps carry around jars of krill and salt water. There was a short silence in the room as we all stared at her, and then Bob burst out in laughter, followed shortly by Sarah and Danis as well. I was grinning too. Best answer so far? After that enlightening conversation, Danis excused himself and disappeared to call his grandmother, the crone, and discuss some plans with her on Alex's behalf. Sarah went off to her own room to dance because she felt like it, which left me alone with Bob, who'd now turned off the vampire show he'd been watching and started some game on the Wii. For a long time I watched, simply because it was better than doing nothing up in our room while I waited for Alexander. It was nearly 11 when I couldn't take it anymore and got up to go to bed and wait for him there, so that at least Bob didn't realize how badly Alexander's absence was affecting me, my body feeling heavy and weary. Don't worry, Brittany, he'll really be back soon. And he's not out there alone, Bob called after me as I started up the stairs. Blushing because he'd seen through me, I called back a thank you and a good night and hurried to the room. There I lay down on the bed and stretched out. It did feel good to do that after having been curled up in a chair or on Andy's bed all day. I'd just given up on trying to read a book and deposit it on the nightstand when I suddenly became aware of a new sensation, a pulling on my body that seemed to get stronger and almost seemed to want me to go through the door and outside, as if something really wanted me to go there. A short moment later, the bedroom door opened, and Alexander stepped into the room and shrugged out off his shirt almost immediately. It was soaked and his hair was dripping water, but I somehow managed to look the other way. Without really saying anything, Alexander sat down on the edge of the bed beside me, his back turned toward me as he took off his shoes and socks. Unable to resist any longer, I ran my fingers over the flawless skin on his back. Marveling at how soft and smooth it felt, stretched over taut muscles, hard as rock, he shivered, and as soon as his shoes dropped to the floor, he turned around and pinned me to the bed. You've been driving me insane all day, agramo kroi. His eyes were very dark, and his pupils diluted as he stared at my lips hungrily. Still, I could sense a weight on his shoulders, a worry that hadn't been there before. I have been driving you insane, I said while I pushed against his shoulder as if trying to get him away from me. Even so, I was reveling at his touch, the tension I'd noticed earlier already leaving my body. If only a little. Oh yes, why the hell were you reading that book anyway? He said huskily, not moving an inch even though I was pushing as hard as I could. After his question, he attached his lips to his favorite part of my neck and started kissing and nibbling. Suppressing a moan, I said, Sarah said I had to read it. I had no clue what it was about. My cheeks flamed red again as I remembered the book and certain scenes. There had been plenty of things in it that I'd like to try out, if ever I'd find the guts for it. Psh, she's always meddling in things that don't need meddling. I'll teach you all you need to know. Oh, run. His eyes burned so dark, they were nearly black as he gazed up at me. My expression seemed to reassure him, and then suddenly he climbed on top me completely and lifted my top in his hands. I hope you're not attached to this, he murmured before a tearing sound echoed through the room. My eyes widened in shock as I realized what he'd just done. Cool air whispered across my chest where my shirt lay in ruins. He'd just torn my shirt apart as if it was nothing. Before I could complain about it, he attacked my lips with his in a toe-curling kiss, his tongue sweeping out to touch the seam of my lips, begging entrance. His hands stroking across the skin he'd just exposed, boldly claiming possession of my breasts. Ribbons of pleasure shot through me, and I realized that I very much loved this possessive, dominant side of him. The hot feminine side of me could definitely appreciate the power and aggression. Still, I wasn't going to let him get away with it that easily. This was a two-way relationship, and I sure as hell wasn't going to surrender to him. Pushing him would never work. I'd already tried that anyway. So instead, I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him closer. Distracting him by raking my fingernails across his back, I slipped my other hand into his silky hair until I had hold of a good bit of it. Once I had hold of it, I yanked his head back hard, smiling when he moaned in surprise. Taking advantage of the moment, I sat up with him and pushed him over so that I could climb on top of him instead. I wasn't shocked when I straddled his hips to feel his erection pressing against me this time, and instead tightened my hold on his hair, using my free hand to trace the musculature of his chest. It was satisfying to see the goosebumps break out across his skin. I like this side of you, Britt," Alexander said as he raised his hips to press himself against the juncture between my legs, eliciting a moan from me. His big hands tore the rest of my shirt from my body and then easily unclasped my bra. I couldn't believe how much I wanted him and how much I let him do to me and my body. I'd never had a boyfriend before, never even kissed another, unless of course you counted that asshole Fort. Suddenly, I felt unsure again and I let go off his hair, sitting back a little to look at his face. Blushing again as I realized how forward I'd just been, Alexander stared up at me, suddenly looking concerned as he asked, "Everything all right, Aguahumoqua?" He ran his fingers across the skin on my sides, then stroked them upward to cut my breasts again, almost as if he couldn't get enough of touching me. I've never done anything like this before, except with you." I didn't know how to finish that sentence, but Alexander seemed to understand. He sat up and pressed me against his chest tightly, his arms wrapping around my waist now while one hand tangled into my hair. "There's no need to worry. You're amazing. You make my head spin," he murmured in my ear softly. "Would you rather just go to sleep now?" He offered then, even though I could tell that he'd much rather wanted to continue what we'd been doing. After all, apparently I'd been driving him insane all day. "Or?" I heard myself ask. He chuckled before replying huskily, "Or you let me bring you pleasure." His hand slipping down to tug teasingly on my shorts, implying that he'd like to take them off. I shivered. "I'm not ready for sex, Alexander." He didn't hesitate as he replied, "That wasn't what I was offering Brittany." His breath fell teasingly across my throat as he buried his face in my neck, pressing soft kisses against the skin there. He paused above my pulse, grazing his fangs over the spot gently. A thought suddenly crossed my mind. "Do you want to drink my blood?" Alexander immediately pulled away so he could look at my eyes. "Never, Britt. I'd never do that to you." "So, why not?" I wondered. "You're my lover, not my food," he said easily. Then he claimed my lips to signal the end of that discussion. "So, did you decide? Is it going to be sleep, or?" I kissed him back fiercely. There is a propelling acoustics of wind both me. I way of arm, my no-ness. I wistus propped around me tightly. I was nearly dozing off when I remembered I wanted to ask him something. My body felt so heavy and content that I groaned when I moved so I could look at his face. Alexander chuckled, looking very satisfied with himself. I was completely amazed that he blatantly refused to let me touch him so he could come as well. Even though he'd brought me to orgasm 3 times with just his fingers, I shook my head and tried to get my thoughts out of the gutter. What was it I wanted to ask him again? Oh, right, about why Andy was so peaceful suddenly. "Alexander, what did you talk to Hay about?" I asked softly as I lifted my leg to entwine it with his. His free hand came up to stroke my hair and push the strands that had fallen across my face behind my ear. "Just, men stuff," he said slowly and very purposely vague. "No, I don't know. I'm not a man, remember?" I retorted. Another chuckle shook his chest before he said huskily, "I'm well aware of that, Agramokroy." Silence settled over us again and I didn't push my question. It was obvious he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe it was something Andy didn't want to share with me. After a while, Alexander asked, "Britt, you know, don't you?" "Know what?" I asked, my breath hitching in my throat. Was he talking about the demon heritage? Had Andy told him? Was that what they talked about? His hold on me tightened a little. pressing me into him as if he was afraid I'd disappear. "It's why you asked me about demons this morning, isn't it? Because you remembered in your dream?" His voice was quiet, calm, and held no accusation whatsoever, but still my stomach clenched painfully. This is where he's going to reject both me and Hay, because he'd found out we were part demon. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remembered this morning. No wonder you shut down like that," Alexander said, sympathy filling his voice now. "I tried to trace him today. That's why I was out in the rain, talking to my sources. But nobody seems to know anything about him." "Trace him? Who? My real birth father? The demon that had raped my mother twice? Oh, I wondered why he even wanted to do that. To check if he was a bad demon? Or was it to find out more information for me? Or was it to make sure that he was able to fight the demon that was our father if necessary? Did Andy tell you?" I asked. Alexander was quiet for a moment before he said, "Andy told me his father visited him every night. He was scared he'd visit again and relieved that it had not happened last night. I asked him why he was scared about that now that he didn't live with the man anymore." He paused to take a deep but unnecessary breath. He said, "No, my real father. Poor kid must have been terrified about sleeping alone. He's a very brave boy." It was quiet again, and I nodded slowly, rubbing my cheek against his chest. "I know. He always wanted to sleep in my room. Stephanie didn't always allow it, though." Alexander suddenly shifted his arms and pulled me across his chest. "Britt, were you scared to tell me? Did you honestly think I'd reject you if I knew?" He gazed at me with his stormy eyes, and the look was so sincere that I felt myself relax. A blush rose to my cheeks as I mumbled, "Maybe a little. I don't know. You can tell me anything. I love you. That's never going to change," he reassured me, rubbing his large hands across my back. "I love you too, Alexander. I guess I was just scared I'd lose you," I admitted. "Let's sleep. Tomorrow we have a long day of school again," Alexander replied, his arms circling around me tightly, pressing me as close to him as possible. His chest vibrating pleasantly as he softly started humming his lullaby. I was nearly asleep when a last question came to my mind. "I still don't understand why Hay isn't scared anymore." "What did you say?" Alexander interrupted his humming to reply, "I guess knowing that he lives with monsters makes him feel safe. Humans can't keep a demon out, but certainly other monsters can." I couldn't argue with that reasoning. It seemed plausible after all. I knew Alexander could keep away a demon. There was no way anyone could be more powerful than him, not after the little I'd seen. Jop says, "I woke with tacting awade, and a tell pine. I was so nervous that I seriously contemplated staying in bed for the day." Alexander was already up and moving about in the darkness of the room. A moment later, I heard him open the door to the bathroom, and shortly after the sounds of the shower. Alexander wasn't going to let me stay home. I just knew he wasn't. As if he knew how I felt, which wasn't entirely unlikely, he returned to the room. "Your turn to gramo groy. School's not going to wait for you." I groaned but flipped on the light, searching for a shirt to put on. My breath hitched in my throat at the sight that met my eyes. Alexander apparently hadn't bothered to take clothes with him to the bathroom and stood in front of the closet with just a towel draped around his lean hips, water dripping from his hair to trail across his skin. At my gasp, he looked over his shoulder to cast me a knowing smirk, one of his perfectly sculptured eyebrows raised. "Something wrong?" I swallowed and shook my head. My hand had finally located a shirt that I hastily pulled over my head. I hadn't bothered to replace the one he'd torn apart last night, but I wasn't about to walk around half naked, not like him. As my head popped through the right hole, I had to gasp again. The insolent man had dropped the bloody towel. I think my face went through a dozen different shades of red before I managed to unscramble my mind enough to get to my feet and rush to the bathroom. He had the nerve to laugh and ask, "Are you sure you're okay, Grumo Krua?" He knew very well what was going on. In the shower, I turned the water to cold, hoping it would take my mind off his naked backside. It didn't help much. When I left the shower, I realized I had nothing to put on except a towel either. But as I opened the door, I saw that I had nothing to worry about. The room was already empty. When I was done dressing and had packed my bag for school, I hurried downstairs as well, pausing in Andy's room to peek inside and see if he was already up or if I needed to help him. The room was empty and his school bag was gone too, so someone had obviously already taken care of him. I found everyone in the kitchen around the large kitchen table, and with everyone, I really did mean everyone. Even Dennis was there, staring moodily at a cup of coffee as if he resented the very idea of getting up. Andy was sitting next to Alexander on a big cushion, so he appeared to be taller than he was, munching away on some kind of multicolored cereal without milk. I frowned at that, but at my look, Andy exclaimed, "Alex said it was okay." I turned to frown at him, but the image of him naked, even though I only saw him from behind, flashed through my head again. He turned his stormy eyes on me with a mischievous twinkle, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. "Why don't you sit down, Gray McCoy?" he offered, pulling out the empty chair on his other side with a wicked grin. Everyone but Andy looked at me with knowing looks. Sarah even gave me a teasing push towards the chair. "I can't imagine what you see in him, love. But oh well, by all means." My face must have turned beet red yet again, but since there were no other chairs available, I made my way over to the one Alexander had pulled out for me. As I sat down, I muttered, "Why is everyone sitting at the breakfast table when only 3 of us here eat?" To hide my embarrassment, I quickly buttered to toast and focused on eating, ignoring the laughter that had erupted around the table. Alexander placed a large, warm hand on my back and rubbed infuriating circles with it. "Do you think you're ready to face school?" he asked. His voice was low and serious again, all traces of humor gone, and at his question, everyone quieted down. I nodded. Sure, why wouldn't I be? Of course they all saw through my act. I was still nervous as hell. "Alexander's. Eh?" Distraction hadn't changed that. "We'll take good care of you. Sarah or Bob will always be close by," and I set up surveillance outside to keep an eye out for any of Thornton's minions. "Hay will have one of my best bodyguards with him at all times," Alexander explained. "I get a bodyguard?" asked Andy. When Alexander nodded, the golden-haired boy nodded enthusiastically. "Cool. Like the president?" "Yeah, like that," my soulmate nodded, rubbing a hand through my little brother's hair. "We don't want you to get hurt. You know, oh, are you going to give Deidre a bodyguard too then?" At the question, everyone stared at him in shock. It seemed to give him an answer because he frowned. "If you're not giving her one, then she can have mine. She's in more danger than I am." "Hey, we can't protect her from herself. Besides, we don't know where she is. She left," I told him, reaching over Alexander to grab his hand. "You can't save everyone, giant. But they do know where she is." "Brittany?" he exclaimed angrily. His hand squeezed mine tightly, and I knew he was angry for some reason I couldn't fathom. Was he mad because we all seemed unwilling to protect Deidre? I doubted the risk was that great anyway. Bodyguards seemed a little unnecessary to me. But if it eased Alexander's mind, I would comply, and it did make me feel better to know someone was watching over Hay. As I looked around the table, I could tell by everyone's faces that it was true what Andy had said. They knew exactly where Deidre was, but they didn't want to protect her. Bob's face had hardened in such a way that he appeared to be crushing his teeth. "Oh right, you do know, so you're just going to let her die, are you?" I frowned at them and then glared at Alexander, whose face had become completely devoid of emotion, a cold look on his face that I didn't care much for. Crossing my arms in front of my chest, I looked at Sarah. "Please tell me you disagree with them. That woman needs help whether we like her or not. Hay's right." Sarah nodded. "I know, Brittany. I've tried to convince them, but they won't have it." She looked apologetically at Andy. "Come on, kid. Let's get your shoes and get ready for school, okay? Your sister will take care of it." Andy nodded and disappeared with her down the hall. Dennis cast us one look, then said, "I don't care what you decide. It's none of my business." "Alex, I'll go see my grandma now to discuss those plans you made with her." That left me with Bob and Alexander. I stood up slowly, looking each of them in the eye for a moment. Bob actually flinched back when I did, but Alexander didn't appear to be impressed. "I know you don't care much for her, Alexander, so I won't bother convincing you with arguments. But you, Bob, you love her. Can you live with yourself if you let her die? It's obvious from last night that they're trying to either kill her or you." I crossed my arms over my chest and focused on him completely, but he just closed his eyes and clenched his mouth shut, his Adam's apple bobbing a few times as he swallowed convulsively, but he still didn't say anything. When the silence stretched, I huffed angrily. "Fine, since that doesn't work." I turned to Alexander and fixed him with another glare. "Until you change your mind about protecting Deidre, you're not touching me, I'll just bunk with Sarah. Got it? Then I turned and stalked out of the kitchen, ignoring the indignant gasp coming from Alexander as I joined Sarah and my brother in the hall. Sarah was staring me with a very impressed look on her face. Well, if that doesn't work, then I don't know what will. All I was thinking, however, was, why the hell did I insist so much that Deidre had to be protected? Last night, I had taken an instant dislike to her, but now, if Hay thought it was so important, it had to be. One thing was sure, though. This entire conflict had taken away all my nerves about going to school today. If I managed Alexander like this, I was sure I could face Jennifer without a problem. In front of the Clitton house, 2 large SUVs were parked, black with black-tinted windows. They looked like the type of car that would come out of a massive car wreck with little more than a scratch, demolishing the other cars involved completely. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they were bulletproof too. Next to the first car stood a tall, lithe man. He was dressed in a crisp suit, the collar of his white shirt open to show a triangle of tawny skin. Expensive sunglasses perched on a straight nose gave him that typical agent look. I assumed that was the bodyguard that would accompany Andy. That was until I noticed another man standing next to the second car. Dressed all in black with a skin the color of charcoal, I hadn't even noticed him there until he'd moved. My God, that man blended in well with the shadows. The first one approached us with an arrogant smirk on his face. "Morning, Miss Baker." His voice was low and rugged, and his walk gave me the distinct feeling of a cat on the prowl. Pure, lethal power coiled beneath a human exterior. With a large but elegant hand, he took off the sunglasses. I couldn't stop myself from gasping at the sight of his eyes. It brought an even more arrogant look to his face. His eyes were the color of molten gold, with such an intense look in them that I could only compare it to that of a cat focused on its prey. A large cat. That wasn't all. The pupils were so large in the dim morning light that there was more black to his eyes than actual gold. The pupil wasn't even completely round, but slightly oval-shaped. "Jaden," Sarah exclaimed from behind me before she suddenly came careening past. She jumped from the stairs at the door straight at him. He caught her easily and spun her around before gently coming to a stop, a warm smile on his face, which was without a doubt breathtakingly handsome. "Hey, Sarah, my love. Long time no see," he said, his voice a rumble. He had yet to let go off her or even put her down. It seemed to be effortless for him to hold her like that, as if she waited nothing at all. Way too long. "Where did Alex send you?" "He wouldn't tell me," Sarah pouted while she stroked a hand through the pure black locks of Jaden's hair, rubbing her fingers behind his ear like you would a cat. I would have called that odd, but even stranger was his reaction. He cocked his head sideways and made a purring sound, low enough that I almost missed it. How much more cat-like could he be? Jaden laughed and put her down, a warm, easy smile on his face that took the edge of that dangerous aura he carried, one that gave me the feeling he was ready to pounce at any moment. "I was just running errands. You know what Alex is like. Seratin is back as well, by the way." The Catman jerked his thumb in the direction of the second car where I knew that black man was standing. Even though I couldn't see him now, Sarah was already rushing over, Jaden completely forgotten. "Miss Baker?" I turned to look at Jaden myself and offered him a tentative smile. I wasn't sure what to make of him. He looked so lethal and so... For some reason, I felt the very strong urge to reach out and pet him. You know, the way you always want to reach out and pet that tiger in the zoo? You know he'd bite your hand off if you tried, but still you have that urge. "If you get into the car, I'm sure Sarah and Bob will join you shortly," he said politely. It didn't suit him. This man was completely untamed and wild, something his suit and sunglasses tried to hide, unsuccessfully. I slowly made my way over to the car and then dared to ask him, "You're the one taking care of surveillance at Westtown High. Does that mean Seratin will be taking care of my little brother?" I stumbled over the unfamiliar name but was relieved to see Jaden nod. "Yes, don't worry, Miss Baker. He'll be in good hands, the best in fact." I wanted to turn and go over to the black man so I could meet him and assure myself that Andy would in fact be going with someone that I'd trust. But just as I moved to do that, Alexander appeared, holding Andy's hand and followed by a very angry-looking Bob. Alexander swung Hay up onto his hip, as if he'd done it a million times before, and then stalked right past me and Jaden. He nodded in the Catman's direction, acknowledging his presence, but that was all. At the second car, he stopped and said, "Seriton." The black man stepped forward out of the dark shadows beside the car, and finally, I was able to see what he looked like. He was tall, almost as tall as Alexander, and that said a lot. His dark skin was so beautiful that I had no words to describe the exact shade of it. His eyes were so dark themselves that they appeared black. The only thing that marred his beauty was a long, jagged scar that ran across the line of his jaw. It looked very cruel and painful, but it was clearly old and faded over time. "My lord," Seriton said, his voice musical and warm, although his posture was tense and withdrawn. I noticed that although Sarah had rushed to meet him, she hadn't actually touched him. "Meet Andy. I entrust you with his safety," was all Alexander said before putting Andy down next to him and reaching into his pocket. From this distance, I couldn't see what he withdrew from it, but whatever it was, he handed it over to the dark man with a nod. It was impossible to read the expression on Seriton's face, but he clenched his fist over his heart and then touched his forehead with his knuckles in a strange kind of salute. "You can rely on me, my lord." Without further ado, he opened the passenger's door to the SUV and gestured for Andy to get into it. I saw a surprised look on my brother's face, which was replaced with determination. He shrugged his shoulders and then reached up to climb into the beast. Alexander stopped him, though. Bending down to his level, he whispered something in my little brother's ears. Then a look of concentration appeared on my soulmate's face as he stared deeply into Andy's eyes. The boy nodded and then smiled warmly, patting Alexander on his cheek. After that, Alexander picked him up and set him down in the seat. He strapped him in the seatbelt and then pressed a kiss to the boy's forehead. "Take care. You better call me if anything happens." Andy waved at me as the SUV pulled away and drove off, and I couldn't help but feel a little worried. Everyone seemed to think that Seriton was the best man on the job, but he seemed so cold and distant that I couldn't imagine him to be very good with children. Alexander strode back over to me, and I felt my heartbeat speed up at the sight of him. I had thought Jaden's walk predatory and lethal, but it paled in comparison to him. He was all danger and male. His stormy eyes flashed angrily as he met mine, but I couldn't help but find it incredibly sexy the way his chocolate brown hair hung messily across his forehead. His jaw set and a frown in place, he reached me. For a painful minute, we just stared at each other. He was only a foot away from me, but the air between us was ripe with tension. Then he lifted his hand as if he wanted to touch my face, and I narrowed my eyes threateningly. "Have you changed your mind?" I asked him as I stepped back a little. He dropped his hand and made a growling sound, his eyes flashing again, but he turned toward Jaden. "You protect her with your life. Nothing is more important. There's a lot of young wolves at the school that think they can claim her. I trust that will be no problem for you," Alexander said, and he sounded very much like a war general now. Jaden scoffed. "Course not, Alex." As if a bunch of mutts would ever be a problem. He turned his startling golden eyes on me with a speculative look in his eyes. "Although, I can see why they'd think that, since you haven't marked her." The young man shrugged his wide shoulders. "I could give her a mark, you know, a temporary one." The growl that erupted from Alexander's throat was downright scary, and had me shaking in my clothes, but Jaden didn't seem fazed by it. He just shrugged his shoulders again, just saying, "It's a lot safer for her if they think she belongs to someone." "I am not letting you mark her, Jay," he said in such a low, deadly voice that Jaden finally took a step back and nodded. "Suit yourself, man. I really, really ought to teach you your place." "You're a royal pain in the ass instead of my loyal subject," Alexander said, but he seemed to relax a little. The comment had a repetitive sound to it, as if he said it all the time to the guy. Jaden just threw back his head and laughed. "You love me, Alex. It's why you keep me around. Admit it." Then he winked and turned to me. "Are you finally getting into the car, or do you feel like taunting your poor mate even longer?" I frowned but decided to obey, and climbed into the back seat of the car, pointedly ignoring the helping hand Alexander held out for me. Sarah jumped in beside me and stuck her tongue out at the two males. "You're so going to be in pain by the end of the day, Mo dear hair," she said before she slammed the door closed on his face. We could both clearly hear Jaden laugh again while he hit Alexander on the shoulder. Bob joined us in the car without a word, and shortly after that Jaden took place behind the wheel and drove off. He followed Alexander's flashy red car out of the drive, and I breathed out in relief when I realized he was going by himself. I suddenly wasn't sure which one of us was going to be in pain by the end of the day. I was the seventh in the seventh and Biliocamatian of Crescent as we arrived. Alexander got no more than the usual gaggle of girls that asked him questions about class and such, and a boy or two ogling his car. But the SUV was something new, and because the windows were so darkly tinted, nobody could see inside it. Bob and Sarah got out of the as if nothing was wrong and they were used to it, which might not be far from the truth. Just before I got out, Jaden stopped me. Miss Baker, stay with Sarah or Bob at all times. If you feel threatened at any point, use them.